The Britain that Julius Caesar first glimpsed across the treacherous waters of the English Channel in 55 BC was a land of extraordinary complexity, far removed from the barbarian wilderness that Roman propaganda would later portray. This island, shrouded in mist and mystery to Mediterranean eyes, harboured a sophisticated tapestry of Celtic societies that had evolved over centuries into distinct tribal confederations, each commanding territories that would later form the backbone of Roman administrative divisions. The Iceni occupied the fertile flatlands of what would become Norfolk and northern Suffolk, their territory stretching from the Wash to the Thames estuary. Archaeological evidence from sites like Snettisham reveals a people of considerable wealth, evidenced by the discovery of over 70 talks of gold and silver, some weighing more than a kilogram. These weren't merely decorative pieces, but symbols of authority and divine connection, crafted with techniques that demonstrated metallurgical skills rivaling those found anywhere in the Celtic world. The Iceni's political structure centred around a monarchy that appears to have maintained relative stability through carefully managed succession practices, with evidence suggesting that women could inherit significant authority, a practice that would later manifest dramatically in the reign of Boudicca. To the north, the Brigantes commanded the largest tribal territory in Britain, encompassing much of what is now Yorkshire, Lancashire, and parts of the Scottish borders. Their name, meaning the elevated ones or hill people, reflected both their geographical dominance and their perceived status among British tribes. The Brigantes operated as a loose confederation of sub-tribes, each maintaining semi-autonomous control over specific regions while acknowledging overall Brigantian authority. Their hill forts, such as the massive complex at Stanwick in North Yorkshire, covered areas exceeding 300 hectares and featured sophisticated defensive earthworks that incorporated multiple phases of construction, suggesting continuous occupation and expansion over several centuries. The Catuvalauni, perhaps the most politically ambitious of the British tribes, controlled territories north of the Thames, including modern Hertfordshire, Bedfordshire, and parts of Buckinghamshire. Under leaders like Cassivelaunus and later Cunobeline, they pursued an aggressive expansionist policy that brought them into conflict with neighbouring tribes, while simultaneously establishing them as the dominant power in southeastern Britain. Their oppidum at Verulamium represented the pinnacle of pre-Roman British urban development, featuring planned streets, specialised craft quarters, and evidence of continental European architectural influences that spoke to their extensive trade connections. The political boundaries between these major tribal groups were neither static nor clearly defined. The Trinovantes, occupying Essex and parts of Suffolk, found themselves increasingly pressured by Catuvalauni expansion, a dynamic that would later provide Caesar with valuable intelligence and potential allies. Similarly, the Atrebates in the south, under King Commius, maintained complex relationships with both continental Gallic tribes and their British neighbours, relationships that shifted between alliance and hostility depending on immediate political circumstances. Iron Age. British society had evolved far beyond simple agricultural communities by the 1st century BC. The hill fort phenomenon, which had begun during the Late Bronze Age, reached its zenith in the centuries immediately preceding Roman invasion. These fortified settlements varied dramatically in size and complexity, from small promontory forts defending a few hectares to massive complexes like Maiden Castle in Dorset, whose elaborate defensive systems covered 19 hectares and housed populations numbering in the thousands. The construction techniques employed in these hill forts demonstrated sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture. Multiple concentric ramparts, carefully positioned entrance passages designed to channel attackers into killing zones, and the strategic placement of storage facilities and water sources within the defensive perimeter all point to military engineering capabilities that had evolved through generations of intertribal warfare. At Danebury in Hampshire, archaeological excavation has revealed evidence of systematic urban planning, with designated areas for metalworking, pottery production and grain storage, suggesting that these sites functioned as true proto-urban centres rather than mere refuges. agricultural practices had become increasingly sophisticated, with evidence of field systems, crop rotation, and selective breeding of livestock. The famous Battersea shield and other decorated metalwork demonstrate that British craftsmen had mastered not only functional ironworking, but also developed distinctive artistic styles that combined continental Latène influences with indigenous British motifs. Coinage, introduced through contact with Gallic tribes, had begun circulating among the southeastern tribes by the 2nd century BC, with rulers like Cunobalin minting coins that proclaimed their authority and advertised their connections to the wider Celtic world. The Druidic system represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of pre-Roman British society. These priests, judges, and teachers maintained an oral tradition that preserved legal codes, historical narratives, and religious practices across tribal boundaries. Druids underwent training periods lasting up to 20 years, memorizing vast quantities of verse that encoded everything from agricultural calendars to genealogical records. Their influence extended beyond purely religious matters. They served as arbitrators in disputes between tribes, maintained the calendar that governed both agricultural and religious activities, and controlled access to the sacred groves where the most important rituals took place. The Druids' power derived partly from their monopoly on literacy. Though they possessed knowledge of writing, they deliberately maintained oral traditions to preserve their exclusive control over knowledge transmission. Their sacred sites, such as the complex at Anglesey, that would later be destroyed by Suetonius Paulinus, served as centres of learning that attracted students from across the Celtic world. The Roman historian Pliny's accounts of Druidic practices, while filtered through Roman prejudices, nevertheless reveal the extent to which these religious specialists had developed systematic approaches to medicine, astronomy, and natural philosophy. Britain's isolation from the continent was far from complete by the 1st century BC. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive trade networks that connected British tribes to markets stretching from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Cornish tin had been reaching continental markets for centuries, while British hunting dogs, slaves, and grain flowed southward in exchange for wine, luxury goods, and manufactured items. The discovery of Roman amphorae at sites like Hengistbury Head demonstrates that direct trade with Roman merchants was well established decades before Caesar's invasions. These commercial relationships inevitably led to diplomatic contacts. Tribal leaders maintained embassies with their continental counterparts, and intermarriage between ruling families created networks of obligation and alliance that transcended the English Channel. The Atrebates, for instance, maintained close connections with their continental namesakes in northern Gaul, relationships that would prove crucial during the later stages of Caesar's Gallic campaigns. Similarly, the Belgae tribes of southern Britain maintained cultural and political ties with their continental relatives, ties that brought them into the orbit of Roman diplomatic activity well before direct military contact occurred. Roman merchants and diplomats had been gathering intelligence about British tribes for decades before Caesar's expeditions. They understood the political divisions between tribal groups, the locations of major settlements, and the personalities of key leaders. This intelligence network proved invaluable when Caesar began planning his British expeditions, providing him with detailed knowledge of tribal rivalries that could be exploited and potential allies who might be recruited against his primary targets. The political landscape of Britain in the mid-1st century BC was characterised by shifting alliances and endemic warfare between tribal confederations. Cassivellaunus had emerged as the dominant war leader among the tribes north of the Thames, but his authority rested on military success rather than traditional legitimacy. His aggressive expansion had created a coalition of enemies, including the Trinovantes, who had been displaced from their traditional territories, and various smaller tribes who feared absorption into a Cativellauni-dominated confederation. The rise of individual war leaders like Cassivellaunus represented a significant shift in British political organisation. Traditional tribal kingship, based on hereditary authority and religious sanction, was giving way to a more militarised form of leadership that emphasised personal charisma and battlefield success. This transformation created opportunities for ambitious individuals to accumulate power across traditional tribal boundaries while simultaneously generating instability as established hierarchies came under challenge. Cassivellaunus himself appears to have been a military innovator, developing cavalry tactics that maximised the mobility advantages that British terrain offered against more heavily equipped continental forces. His forces employed hit-and-run tactics, using their knowledge of local geography to avoid decisive engagements while wearing down enemy forces through constant harassment. These tactical innovations would prove effective against Caesar's initial expeditions, forcing the Roman commander to adapt his own strategies to meet the unique challenges of British warfare. The weapons and equipment employed by British warriors reflected both indigenous traditions and continental influences. Iron swords of excellent quality, often decorated with intricate patterns, served as both functional weapons and status symbols. British smiths had mastered the production of pattern-welded blades that combined strength with flexibility, creating weapons that could match anything produced in Gaul or the Mediterranean world. Shields, spears and helmets showed similar levels of craftsmanship, while the famous war chariots that so impressed Roman observers represented a uniquely British adaptation of continental Celtic military technology. The social structure underlying this military organisation was complex and hierarchical. Warriors formed the apex of society, with their status determined by both birth and battlefield achievement. Below them, craftsmen, farmers and traders occupied various levels of a social pyramid that was both more fluid and more merit-based than Roman society. Slavery existed, but appears to have been less institutionalised than in the Mediterranean world, with slaves often being war captives who could potentially earn their freedom through service or adoption into their captor's household. Women occupied positions of authority that would have seemed remarkable to Roman observers. Archaeological evidence suggests that some women served as warriors, while others clearly wielded political power as rulers or regents. The later prominence of figures like Boudica and Cartimandua reflected established precedents rather than exceptional circumstances, indicating that British society had developed different concepts of gender roles than those prevalent in the classical world. The religious landscape of pre-Roman Britain was dominated by the Druidic system, but local and regional variations created a complex tapestry of beliefs and practices. Sacred groves, springs and hilltop shrines dotted the landscape, each associated with particular deities or spirits that governed local affairs. The practice of depositing valuable objects in water, swords, shields, jewellery and coins suggests sophisticated concepts of sacrifice and divine reciprocity that governed relationships between the human and supernatural worlds. Human sacrifice, which would later provide Roman propagandists with powerful ammunition against British barbarism, appears to have been practiced but was likely reserved for extraordinary circumstances or major religious festivals. The bog bodies discovered at sites like Lindo Moss suggest that such sacrifices followed elaborate rituals and may have been connected to divination practices or crisis management during periods of social or environmental stress. The material culture of Iron Age Britain demonstrated sophisticated artistic traditions that had evolved over centuries of cultural exchange and indigenous development. The distinctive British style of metalwork, characterised by flowing curves and intricate interlacing patterns, represented a mature artistic tradition that had absorbed continental influences while maintaining its own aesthetic identity. Pottery, textiles and woodworking all showed similar levels of sophistication, creating a material environment that was both functional and aesthetically pleasing. Settlement patterns varied considerably across different regions and tribal territories. In the southeast, nucleated settlements and emerging oppida reflected continental influences and increasing social stratification. In the north and west, dispersed farmsteads and small villages remained the norm, though these too showed evidence of increasing prosperity and technological sophistication. The diversity of settlement types reflected both environmental adaptations and cultural preferences that had developed over centuries of regional evolution. The agricultural foundation of British society had evolved considerably by the 1st century BC. Field systems, evident in aerial photography and archaeological survey, demonstrate systematic land management that maximised productivity while maintaining soil fertility. The introduction of new crops, including various grains and legumes, had diversified the agricultural base and reduced vulnerability to harvest failures. Livestock breeding had produced specialised breeds adapted to local conditions, while innovations in tool design had increased agricultural efficiency. Trade networks connected even remote British communities to wider exchange systems that stretched across northern Europe. Goods moved along established routes that followed river valleys and ancient trackways, creating economic relationships that transcended tribal boundaries. These networks not only facilitated the exchange of material goods, but also served as conduits for ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that gradually transformed British society. The cumulative effect of these developments was to create a British society that was far more complex and sophisticated than Roman stereotypes would suggest. The tribes that Caesar would encounter were not primitive barbarians, but organised societies with their own traditions of law, religion, and governance. Their military capabilities, political institutions, and cultural achievements represented centuries of indigenous development that had been enriched but not dominated by continental contacts. This was the Britain that stood on the threshold of Roman invasion, confident, divided, and utterly unprepared for the systematic conquest that would transform it forever. Caesar's decision to invade Britain emerged from a complex web of political ambition, military pragmatism, and personal curiosity that characterised his entire Gallic campaign. By 55 BC, his conquest of Gaul had reached a critical juncture where continued success required not merely the subjugation of existing enemies, but the demonstration of Roman power beyond the known world. Britain represented the ultimate prize for a commander whose political survival depended on maintaining his reputation as Rome's most daring and successful general. The island's mysterious nature, its rumoured wealth in precious metals and pearls, and its role as a sanctuary for Gallic refugees, provided Caesar with multiple justifications for an expedition that was as much about Roman domestic politics as British conquest. The intelligence Caesar had gathered through merchants, diplomats, and Gallic informants painted a picture of a wealthy but politically fragmented island whose tribal divisions could be exploited through the same combination of military pressure and diplomatic manipulation that had proven so effective in Gaul. Commius, king of the Atrebates, had already established himself as a valuable intermediary between Roman and British interests, providing Caesar with detailed information about tribal territories, seasonal patterns, and the locations of major settlements. More crucially, Commius had identified potential allies among tribes that had suffered under Cassivellaunus's expanding influence, particularly the Trinovantes, whose displacement from their traditional territories had created a reservoir of resentment that Roman diplomacy could tap. The practical challenges of mounting an amphibious assault across the English Channel required logistical innovations that tested even Caesar's considerable organisational abilities. Roman military doctrine had evolved primarily for continental campaigns, where supply lines could be maintained over land, and naval operations remained subsidiary to land-based strategy. An invasion of Britain demanded the construction of specialised transport vessels capable of carrying not only legionaries, but also cavalry, siege equipment, and the massive quantities of supplies necessary to sustain an army operating beyond the reach of established Roman logistics networks. Caesar's shipbuilders, working under intense time pressure during the summer of 55 BC, produced a fleet that represented a compromise between ideal specifications and practical constraints. The transport vessels were broader and shallower than traditional Roman warships, designed to navigate tidal waters and beach themselves on unknown shores. These modifications, while necessary for the specific challenges of British invasion, created vessels that were less seaworthy in rough weather and more vulnerable to the unpredictable tidal patterns that characterise channel waters. The cavalry transports posed particular problems, requiring specialised loading ramps and internal modifications to accommodate horses that had never experienced sea travel. The initial crossing on August 26, 55 BC, immediately revealed the inadequacy of Roman intelligence regarding British coastal conditions. Caesar's fleet, comprising approximately 80 transports carrying 2 legions, the 7th and 10th, encountered a shoreline that bore little resemblance to the gently shelving beaches his scouts had described. The White Cliffs of Dover presented an impossible landing site, with British warriors positioned on the heights above, their weapons glinting in the afternoon sun as they prepared to rain projectiles down on any Roman foolish enough to attempt a landing. The sight of these defenders, their bodies painted with woad and their hair stiffened with lime, created an impression of barbarian ferocity that even veteran legionaries found unsettling. Caesar's decision to move the fleet northward along the coast demonstrated both tactical flexibility and the dangerous unpredictability of amphibious operations. The 7 miles to the eventual landing site near Deal consumed precious hours while British scouts tracked the Roman movement, alerting tribal forces throughout the region to the invasion's progress. This delay allowed Cassivellaunus to coordinate a defensive response that transformed what Caesar had envisioned as a surprise assault into a contested landing against prepared opposition. The beach landing itself became one of the most dramatic episodes in Caesar's military career, though his own account in the Commentaria deliberately understated the genuine peril his forces faced. The transport vessels, unable to approach close to shore due to their deep draught, left the legionaries facing a wade of several hundred yards through surf, while British chariots, cavalry and infantry harassed them from the beach. The famous incident of the 10th Legion's standard-bearer leaping into the waves while shouting encouragement to his comrades represented not heroic inspiration, but desperate necessity, as the assault threatened to stall in the surf with catastrophic consequences for Roman prestige. The British defenders employed tactics that exploited every advantage their local knowledge provided. Chariots raced along the waterline, their crews hurling spears and javelins at Romans struggling through the waves while remaining beyond effective retaliation range. British cavalry struck at isolated groups of legionaries who had become separated from their units during the chaotic landing, while infantry formations waited in the dunes behind the beach to engage any Romans who successfully reached dry ground. The coordination of these different combat arms demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that contradicted Roman assumptions about British military capabilities. Caesar's deployment of his warship's artillery proved decisive in establishing the initial beachhead. The ballistas and catapults mounted on these vessels could reach targets on the beach and in the immediate hinterland, forcing British formations to withdraw beyond effective range while providing covering fire for the struggling legionaries. The psychological impact of these unfamiliar weapons, whose projectiles could penetrate British shields and armour at ranges where retaliation was impossible, created gaps in the defensive line that Roman organisation and discipline could exploit. The establishment of a fortified camp on British soil marked the first permanent Roman presence in the island, though the position remained precarious throughout the expedition's duration. The camp's construction followed standard Roman military engineering practices, but the unfamiliar terrain and the constant threat of British attack complicated every aspect of the work. The legionaries had to adapt their techniques to deal with different soil conditions, unknown water sources, and construction materials that differed significantly from those available in Gaul. The defensive perimeter required constant vigilance, as British warriors demonstrated an uncanny ability to approach undetected through countryside they had known since childhood. British tactical responses to Roman presence revealed military traditions that had evolved independently of continental influences, while remaining remarkably effective against conventional Roman methods. The chariot warfare that so impressed Caesar represented a uniquely British adaptation of Celtic military technology, combining the mobility of cavalry with the shock power of infantry in ways that maximised the advantages of local terrain. British charioteers would drive their vehicles at high speed toward Roman formations, dismount their warriors at optimal striking distance, then withdraw to safety while the infantry engaged, ready to retrieve their passengers if retreat became necessary. The speed and agility of British horses, bred for generations in the island's particular conditions, gave these chariots capabilities that continental equivalents could not match. British drivers had mastered techniques for navigating rough terrain at speeds that seemed impossible to Roman observers, while their warriors had developed the balance and coordination necessary to fight effectively from moving platforms. The psychological impact of these attacks, with their thundering approach and wild battle cries, created disruption in Roman ranks that went beyond their actual tactical effectiveness. Caesar's attempts to establish diplomatic contact with British tribal leaders during the first expedition met with limited success, hampered by mutual suspicion and the obvious military nature of the Roman presence. The envoys sent by various tribes came to the Roman camp under flags of truce, but their negotiations revealed the complex political calculations that governed British responses to Roman invasion. Some tribal representatives expressed willingness to submit to Roman authority, but their offers were clearly tactical maneuvers designed to protect their territories, while their neighbours bore the brunt of Roman military pressure. The tribute arrangements that emerged from these negotiations established patterns that would persist throughout the Roman occupation of Britain. Caesar demanded hostages from submitting tribes, a practice that served multiple purposes beyond simple security. These hostages, typically drawn from tribal nobility, provided intelligence about British political structures while serving as leverage in future negotiations. Their presence in the Roman camp also demonstrated to other tribes the reality of Roman power and the consequences of continued resistance. The 18-day duration of the first expedition reflected the practical limitations that constrained Roman operations in Britain. The approaching equinox brought weather conditions that made channel crossings increasingly dangerous, while the expedition's limited supplies created logistical pressures that could not be ignored. Caesar's decision to withdraw was presented as a successful reconnaissance in force, but the expedition's abbreviated duration suggested that the challenges of British invasion had proven greater than anticipated. The destruction of Roman ships during a channel storm while the fleet lay beached provided British observers with valuable intelligence about Roman vulnerabilities. The sight of Roman sailors struggling to repair their vessels demonstrated that the invaders were not invulnerable, while the obvious Roman concern about weather conditions revealed dependencies that British resistance could potentially exploit. These observations would influence British strategic planning for the inevitable return of Roman forces. Caesar's preparations for the 54 BC expedition reflected lessons learned from the previous year's experiences, though political pressures in Rome limited the resources available for British operations. The construction of a larger fleet incorporating design modifications based on channel sailing conditions demonstrated Roman adaptability while revealing the scale of logistical challenges that British invasion presented. The new vessels featured reduced drafts for easier beaching, increased beam for greater stability, and specialised modifications for cavalry transport that addressed specific problems encountered during the first crossing. The recruitment of additional legions for the second expedition, ultimately 5 legions plus auxiliary forces totaling approximately 25,000 men, reflected both Caesar's increased ambitions and his recognition that British conquest required larger forces than initially anticipated. The inclusion of substantial cavalry contingents, drawn primarily from Germanic tribes allied to Rome, addressed the mobility disadvantages that had hampered Roman operations during the first expedition. These horsemen, familiar with the tactical challenges of fighting mounted opponents, provided capabilities that Roman military doctrine had not previously emphasized. The second landing, executed on July 6, 54 BC, proceeded with far greater efficiency than the previous year's chaotic assault. The larger fleet allowed Caesar to transport his entire force in a single crossing, eliminating the vulnerabilities that had resulted from the staged arrival of different units. The British response, while still determined, lacked the coordination that had characterised the previous year's defence, suggesting that tribal unity was fragmenting under the pressure of Roman diplomatic initiatives. Caesar's rapid advance inland during the second expedition demonstrated both improved Roman logistics and the effectiveness of pre-invasion intelligence gathering. The march route, carefully planned to avoid major British strongholds while maintaining access to water sources and forage, reflected detailed knowledge of British geography that could only have been obtained through extensive reconnaissance. The speed of the Roman advance, covering significant distances within days of landing, prevented British forces from organising coordinated resistance while demonstrating Roman capabilities to potential tribal allies. The crossing of the Thames represented the expedition's most significant tactical achievement, forcing British defenders to abandon their strongest natural defensive position while opening the heartland of Cassivelaunus's territory to Roman penetration. The river crossing itself required engineering skills that demonstrated Roman military capabilities to British observers, while providing Caesar with a dramatic achievement to report to Rome: the construction of temporary bridges under enemy fire, the coordination of multiple legion crossings, and the establishment of secure bridgeheads on the northern bank all showcased Roman military professionalism at its most effective. Cassivelaunus's response to the Thames crossing revealed both his tactical acumen and the limitations of British military organisation. His decision to avoid pitched battles while maintaining constant pressure through guerrilla attacks demonstrated strategic thinking that recognised Roman superiority in conventional engagements. The systematic removal of cattle and supplies from areas threatened by Roman advance showed sophisticated understanding of logistical warfare, while the coordination of attacks by different tribal contingents revealed command and control capabilities that impressed even Roman observers. The British employment of chariots as rapid response forces during this phase of the campaign showcased tactical innovations that had evolved specifically to counter Roman military methods. Rather than using chariots for direct assault, British commanders deployed them as mobile platforms for delivering fresh warriors to threatened sectors while evacuating casualties and maintaining communications between dispersed forces. This adaptation transformed chariots from shock weapons into tactical multipliers that enhanced the effectiveness of British infantry while maintaining the mobility necessary for effective guerrilla warfare. Caesar's diplomatic offensive during the second expedition proved more successful than his military operations in achieving lasting results. The defection of the Trinovantes, formalised through the submission of Romano-British as a client king, provided Rome with its first reliable British ally while demonstrating to other tribes that Roman protection could be more valuable than continued resistance. The Trinovantian submission included the provision of hostages, tribute payments, and military assistance against Cassivelaunus, establishing precedents that would govern Romano-British relations for generations. The cascade of tribal submissions that followed the Trinovantian defection revealed the fragility of British unity in the face of Roman diplomatic pressure. The Cerimagni, Segontiaci, Ancalites, Bibroci, and Cassi all sent embassies to Caesar offering submission, though the sincerity of these offers remained questionable given the obvious military pressure that prompted them. Each submission included negotiations over tribute levels, hostage exchanges, and territorial arrangements that reflected the specific circumstances of individual tribes, while establishing Roman authority as the arbiter of intertribal disputes. The siege of Cassivelaunus's stronghold demonstrated Roman siege warfare capabilities to British observers, while providing Caesar with a dramatic climax for his expedition narrative. The fortification itself, protected by forests and marshes with a single narrow approach, represented sophisticated British defensive architecture that had evolved through generations of intertribal warfare. Roman siege techniques, including the construction of approach works and the deployment of artillery, overcame these defences through systematic application of engineering principles that British military tradition had not encountered. The final submission of Cassivelaunus, negotiated through Commius as an intermediary, established the framework for Roman-British relations that would persist until Claudius's invasion nearly a century later. The tribute arrangements, set at an annual payment that acknowledged Roman supremacy without imposing crippling financial burdens, reflected Caesar's understanding that sustainable client relationships required careful balance between demonstration of power and practical governance. The hostage exchanges that sealed the agreement provided Rome with leverage over British politics while offering tribal leaders insurance against rivals who might challenge their Roman-sanctioned authority. The strategic impact of Caesar's expeditions extended far beyond their immediate military and diplomatic achievements. The intelligence gathered during these campaigns provided future Roman commanders with detailed knowledge of British geography, tribal politics, and military capabilities that would prove invaluable during subsequent invasion planning. The establishment of client relationships with key tribal leaders created networks of Roman influence that persisted through decades of political change, while the demonstration of Roman military capabilities fundamentally altered British perceptions of continental power. The expedition's influence on Roman strategic thinking about Britain proved equally significant, though not always in ways that Caesar had intended. The practical difficulties of channel crossings, the logistical challenges of supplying armies operating beyond established Roman infrastructure, and the tactical adaptations required to counter British military methods all provided lessons that shaped subsequent Roman planning. The recognition that British conquest would require sustained commitment of substantial resources influenced Roman strategic priorities for generations, contributing to the delay between Caesar's expeditions and Claudius's eventual conquest. The transformation of Britain from an unknown island beyond the world's edge into a documented target for Roman expansion represented perhaps the expedition's most lasting achievement. Caesar's detailed accounts, supplemented by the reports of merchants, diplomats, and military observers, created a body of knowledge about British conditions that made systematic conquest feasible. The establishment of regular diplomatic and commercial contacts maintained Roman awareness of British political developments while providing channels for future Roman influence. The nearly century-long hiatus between Caesar's expeditions and Claudius's decisive invasion of Britain in 43 AD reflected not Roman disinterest, but rather the empire's preoccupation with more pressing strategic concerns. The civil wars that consumed the late Republic, followed by Augustus's consolidation of imperial power and the subsequent focus on Rhine and Danube frontiers, relegated Britain to the status of a distant client relationship that required minimal Roman resources while providing acceptable returns through tribute and trade agreements. However, by the reign of Claudius, a convergence of political necessity, economic opportunity, and strategic calculation made British conquest not merely attractive but essential for the survival of an emperor whose legitimacy remained questionable in the eyes of Rome's military and senatorial classes. Claudius's accession to imperial power in January 41 AD had been an accident of history rather than the result of careful succession planning. The assassination of Caligula by Praetorian conspirators had left the Julio-Claudian dynasty without an obvious heir, and Claudius's elevation by the Praetorian Guard represented a desperate attempt to maintain dynastic continuity, rather than a deliberate choice of the most qualified candidate. His physical disabilities, scholarly temperament, and lack of military experience made him appear weak to constituencies that valued martial prowess above administrative competence. The new emperor understood that his survival depended on demonstrating capabilities that his critics claimed he lacked, and military conquest offered the most direct path to establishing the credibility that political manoeuvring alone could not provide. The British political landscape of the early 1st century AD presented Rome with both opportunities and challenges that differed significantly from the conditions Caesar had encountered. Cunoblin's long reign over the Catuvellauni had created a degree of political centralisation in southeastern Britain that simplified Roman strategic planning while simultaneously concentrating opposition under experienced leadership. His sons, Graticus and Togodumnus, had inherited not only their father's territories but also his anti-Roman policies and his understanding of continental political developments. The expulsion of Verica, the pro-Roman king of the Atrebates, provided Claudius with a diplomatic pretext for intervention while demonstrating that British politics had evolved beyond the simple tribal rivalries that Caesar had exploited. The intelligence available to Roman planners in 43 AD far exceeded anything Caesar had possessed, reflecting decades of commercial contact, diplomatic correspondence, and systematic information gathering. Roman merchants operating from Gallic ports had established regular trading relationships with British tribes, providing detailed knowledge of seasonal patterns, tribal boundaries, and economic resources. The presence of Roman political refugees in British courts, including members of various tribal royal families who had fled intertribal conflicts, created networks of informants whose reliability had been tested through years of correspondence. Most significantly, the establishment of permanent Roman naval bases along the Gallic coast had enabled systematic reconnaissance of British coastal defences and landing sites. Aulus Plautius, selected by Claudius to command the invasion force, brought credentials that reflected both military competence and political reliability. His service as governor of Pannonia had demonstrated his ability to manage complex provincial administration while maintaining military readiness along contested frontiers. His family connections to the imperial household provided Claudius with confidence in his loyalty, while his reputation among the legions ensured that his appointment would not generate the kind of military resistance that had plagued previous imperial commanders. The selection of Plautius represented Claudius's understanding that British conquest required not merely tactical skill, but also the administrative capabilities necessary to transform military victory into sustainable provincial governance. The invasion force assembled for the British campaign reflected both the scale of Claudius's ambitions and the resources available to an emperor who enjoyed the support of Rome's financial establishment. 4 legions formed the expedition's core: Legio II Augusta, commanded by the future Emperor Vespasian; Legio IX Hispana, veterans of Germanic campaigns; Legio IV Gemina, experienced in Pannonian warfare; and Legio III Valeria Victrix, drawn from Rhine garrisons. These formations totaled approximately 20,000 legionaries, supported by an equal number of auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire. Germanic cavalry, Balearic slingers, Gallic infantry and Thracian light troops provided specialized capabilities that Roman military doctrine had learned to integrate effectively with legionary formations. The logistical preparations for the invasion demonstrated Roman organizational capabilities at their most sophisticated. The construction of specialized transport vessels incorporated lessons learned from Caesar's expeditions while addressing the specific requirements of a conquest force intended for permanent occupation rather than temporary raiding. The new ships featured reinforced hulls capable of withstanding repeated beaching operations, expanded cargo capacity for siege equipment and construction materials, and improved stability for cavalry transport. The assembly of supplies for the expedition required coordination between multiple provinces, with grain from Egypt, weapons from Spanish armories, and siege equipment from Italian workshops converging on Gallic ports during the winter of 42-43 AD. The selection of Richborough as the primary landing site reflected careful analysis of British coastal conditions, combined with strategic considerations that prioritised rapid advance inland over tactical surprise. The broad shelving beaches of the Kentish coast provided ideal conditions for mass landings while offering access to river systems that could support subsequent supply operations. The proximity to Gallic ports minimised crossing distances and reduced exposure to channel weather, while the local geography offered multiple route options for advancing toward British population centres. Most significantly, intelligence indicated that Richborough lay within the territory of tribes whose loyalty to Catuvellauni authority remained questionable, suggesting that initial resistance might be limited. The invasion fleet that departed from Boulogne in May 43 AD comprised over 800 vessels of various types, representing the largest amphibious operation in Roman military history to that point. The crossing proceeded with remarkable efficiency, reflecting both careful planning and favourable weather conditions that had been absent during Caesar's expeditions. The staggered departure of different squadron elements prevented congestion in Gallic ports while ensuring that the entire force could be reassembled quickly upon reaching British waters. The use of experienced Gallic pilots, familiar with channel tides and currents, eliminated the navigation errors that had complicated earlier Roman maritime operations. The British response to news of the Roman invasion revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the political system that Cunobelin's successors had inherited. Caratacus and Togodumnus succeeded in assembling a confederation of tribal forces that included not only their own Catuvelauni warriors, but also contingents from the Trinovantes, Iceni, and various smaller tribes whose independence depended on preventing Roman domination. However, the speed of Roman preparations had prevented effective coordination of defensive measures, while the political divisions that persisted despite apparent unity created vulnerabilities that Roman intelligence had identified and planned to exploit. The landing at Richborough on May 8, 43 AD, proceeded with none of the drama that had characterised Caesar's beach assaults. Roman intelligence had accurately identified the absence of significant British forces in the immediate area, allowing the invasion fleet to disembark its troops and equipment without serious opposition. The establishment of a fortified beachhead followed standard Roman military procedures, but the scale and permanence of the installations made clear that this expedition intended to remain. The construction of supply depots, equipment parks, and administrative facilities demonstrated Roman commitment to sustained operations that went far beyond the temporary raids that British leaders had experienced previously. Plautius's initial advance inland demonstrated tactical innovations that reflected Roman adaptation to British conditions, while maintaining the systematic approach that characterised imperial military doctrine. The four legions advanced along parallel routes that maintained mutual support while covering maximum territory, with auxiliary forces screening the flanks and maintaining communications between the main columns. This deployment prevented British forces from concentrating against any single Roman formation, while ensuring that resistance in one sector could be rapidly reinforced from adjacent areas. The speed of the Roman advance, covering nearly 20 miles in the first 3 days, prevented British forces from organising coordinated resistance while demonstrating Roman capabilities to potential tribal allies. The first significant engagement occurred at the River Medway, where Caratacus had positioned his forces to contest the Roman advance toward the Thames Valley. The British defensive position exploited natural obstacles that channeled Roman formations into predetermined killing zones, while providing British chariots and cavalry with mobility advantages that rough terrain typically denied them. The fortifications constructed along the river's southern bank incorporated both traditional British earthworks and innovations that reflected continental influences, suggesting that British military engineering had continued evolving during the decades since Caesar's expeditions. The 2-day battle that ensued demonstrated both Roman tactical superiority and British tactical adaptation in ways that influenced military thinking on both sides. British forces employed coordinated attacks by different tribal contingents, with Catuvelauni warriors holding the centre, while Trinovantian and Iceni forces attempted to outflank Roman positions. The use of chariots as mobile command platforms allowed British leaders to coordinate these complex manoeuvres while maintaining communications across extended battle lines. British archery, employing longbows whose range exceeded that of Roman javelins, created casualty rates that forced Roman formations to adapt their standard assault techniques. Roman victory at the Medway resulted from tactical innovations that demonstrated the flexibility of imperial military doctrine when confronted with unfamiliar challenges. The deployment of Batavian auxiliaries, experienced in river warfare from their service along Rhine frontiers, enabled Roman forces to cross the Medway at unexpected points while British attention focused on the main crossing sites. These Germanic warriors, comfortable fighting in water and capable of swimming in full equipment, established footholds on the northern bank that British forces could not eliminate. The subsequent deployment of legionary formations across these secured crossing points created multiple threats that British defensive arrangements could not contain simultaneously. The death of Togodumnus during the Medway fighting eliminated one of the two primary British war leaders, while demonstrating to tribal contingents that Roman military superiority was not merely propaganda. The circumstances of his death, killed while leading a cavalry charge against Roman positions that had been weakened by British archery, showed both British tactical competence and the limitations of individual heroism against systematic Roman military organisation. His loss created command problems within the British Confederation that Caratacus could not immediately resolve, contributing to the tactical confusion that allowed Roman forces to complete their river crossing and establish secure positions on the northern bank. The Roman advance toward the Thames following the Medway victory demonstrated Plautius's understanding that speed was essential to prevent British forces from regrouping while maintaining the psychological momentum that military success had created. The march covered the 50 miles between the two rivers in less than a week, with Roman forces moving along multiple routes that prevented British harassing attacks from achieving decisive results. The systematic destruction of British settlements along the route of advance served both logistical and psychological purposes, providing Roman forces with supplies while demonstrating to British observers the consequences of continued resistance. The Thames crossing presented Plautius with tactical challenges that differed significantly from those encountered at the Medway, reflecting both British adaptation to Roman methods and the strategic importance of London's river crossing to British political geography. Caratacus had positioned his remaining forces along the Thames's northern bank in fortifications that incorporated lessons learned from the Medway defeat, with multiple defensive lines that could absorb Roman assault while maintaining retreat routes toward the interior. The river itself presented obstacles that Roman engineering would need to overcome under hostile fire, while British control of the crossing points eliminated the tactical surprise that had proven decisive at the earlier engagement. Roman engineering capabilities proved decisive in overcoming British defensive preparations at the Thames crossing. The construction of temporary bridges at multiple points simultaneously prevented British forces from concentrating their defensive efforts while providing Roman formations with tactical flexibility that British defensive arrangements could not counter. The deployment of artillery to suppress British positions during bridge construction demonstrated Roman technological advantages that British military tradition had not encountered, while the systematic coordination of engineering work with tactical operations showcased Roman military professionalism at its most effective. The establishment of Roman positions north of the Thames created the strategic situation that Claudius had envisioned when planning the invasion. British resistance, while continuing under Caratacus's leadership, could no longer prevent Roman access to the political heartland of southeastern Britain. The tribal confederation that had initially opposed the invasion began fragmenting as individual tribes calculated that accommodation with Roman power offered better prospects than continued resistance. The submission of the Dobuni, whose territory controlled access routes to the west, provided Roman forces with their first significant British allies, while demonstrating to other tribes that Roman client status could be more attractive than independence. Plautius's decision to halt the advance and request Claudius's presence for the final phase of the conquest reflected both military prudence and political calculation. The pause allowed Roman forces to consolidate their positions while providing time for additional tribal submissions that would reduce the casualties required for complete conquest. More importantly, it ensured that Claudius would receive personal credit for the campaign's climactic achievements, addressing the political necessities that had motivated the invasion, while maintaining the military momentum that Roman success had created. The emperor's arrival in Britain during late summer 43 AD represented a carefully orchestrated demonstration of imperial power that served multiple audiences simultaneously. The presence of Claudius himself, accompanied by Praetorian Guard units and members of the imperial court, demonstrated to British tribes that Roman commitment to conquest was absolute and permanent. For Roman audiences, the emperor's personal participation in military operations addressed criticisms of his martial capabilities while providing dramatic material for the propaganda that would justify the invasion's enormous costs. The inclusion of elephants in the imperial entourage, while militarily unnecessary, created psychological impact that British observers would remember and report throughout the island. The advance on Camulodunum, the Catuvelloni capital and symbolic centre of British resistance, proceeded as a triumphal procession rather than a military campaign. The systematic submission of tribes along the route of advance reflected both Roman diplomatic success and British recognition that continued resistance was futile. The Iceni, Coriel Tauvi, and various smaller tribal groups sent embassies offering submission and tribute, while their warriors joined Roman forces as auxiliaries rather than opponents. This cascade of submissions eliminated organised resistance, while providing Claudius with the appearance of conquering numerous British kingdoms through personal leadership. The surrender of Camulodunum without siege demonstrated the collapse of British resistance, while providing Claudius with the symbolic victory that Roman audiences expected. The formal submission ceremonies, conducted with elaborate ritual that combined Roman imperial protocol with British tribal traditions, established precedents for Romano-British political relationships that would govern provincial administration for centuries. The installation of client kings, the establishment of tribute arrangements, and the designation of territories for direct Roman administration all reflected systematic planning that transformed military conquest into governmental structure. The establishment of Camulodunum as the capital of the new province of Britannia represented both practical necessity and symbolic statement. The site's existing infrastructure, including roads, water systems, and administrative buildings, provided the foundation for Roman governmental operations, while its political significance to British tribes made Roman control of the location a powerful demonstration of imperial authority. The construction of a temple dedicated to Claudius at the heart of the former British capital created a permanent monument to Roman conquest, while establishing the religious foundations that would integrate British territories into imperial administrative systems. The client-king arrangements that emerged from the conquest demonstrated Roman understanding that sustainable provincial control required collaboration with existing British political structures rather than their complete replacement. Cogidubnus of the Regnenses received expanded territories and enhanced status in exchange for his early submission and continued loyalty, while Prasutagus of the Iceni maintained internal autonomy within his tribal boundaries in return for tribute payments and military cooperation. These arrangements provided Roman administration with local knowledge and legitimacy, while offering British leaders opportunities to maintain authority within the new imperial framework. The expansion of Roman control beyond the initial conquest zones required a fundamental transformation in imperial military strategy, moving from the rapid territorial seizure that had characterized Plautius's campaign to the methodical pacification that would define the next 2 decades of British occupation. The appointment of Publius Ostorius Scapula as governor in 47 AD marked this strategic shift, bringing to Britain a commander whose experience in Dalmatian campaigns had demonstrated his capacity for the patient, grinding warfare necessary to subdue resistant populations in difficult terrain. Scapula's mandate extended far beyond simple military occupation. He was tasked with creating the administrative and economic foundations that would transform conquered territories into productive imperial provinces, while simultaneously extending Roman authority into regions that had thus far remained beyond direct control. The Silures of southeastern Wales represented the most formidable challenge to Roman expansion, their territory encompassing the mountainous regions between the Severn Estuary and the Irish Sea that provided natural fortifications unmatched anywhere else in Britain. These warriors had absorbed refugees from conquered territories throughout the conquest period, swelling their numbers while gaining valuable intelligence about Roman military methods from survivors of earlier campaigns. Under the leadership of Caratacus, who had fled westward following the fall of Camulodunum, the Silures had evolved from a traditional tribal confederation into something approaching a professional resistance movement, employing guerrilla tactics that exploited every advantage their mountainous homeland provided. Scapula's initial campaigns against the Silures reveal the limitations of conventional Roman military doctrine, when applied to terrain that negated the tactical advantages of legionary formations. The narrow valleys and steep hillsides of Welsh mountains channeled Roman columns into predictable routes where Silurian ambushes could inflict maximum casualties, while maintaining escape routes that pursuing Romans could not effectively block. The dense forests that covered much of the region provided concealment for British forces while limiting the effectiveness of Roman artillery and cavalry, creating tactical conditions that favoured defenders who possessed intimate knowledge of local geography over invaders dependent on systematic military procedures. The Roman response to these challenges demonstrated the adaptability that had made imperial armies successful across diverse geographical and cultural environments. Scapula modified standard legionary tactics to emphasise smaller unit operations that could navigate difficult terrain while maintaining the discipline and coordination that gave Roman forces their tactical superiority. The deployment of auxiliary cohorts drawn from mountainous regions of the empire provided specialised capabilities that complemented legionary strengths while offering cultural and linguistic skills that proved valuable in intelligence gathering and local negotiations. Germanic and Gallic units, experienced in forest warfare, adapted their techniques to Welsh conditions while maintaining the systematic approach that characterised Roman military operations. The construction of Roman roads through Welsh territory represented both a logistical necessity and a strategic weapon that gradually shifted tactical advantages toward imperial forces. These engineering projects, executed under constant harassment from Silurian raiders, required massive labour inputs and sophisticated defensive arrangements that stretched Roman resources while demonstrating imperial commitment to permanent occupation. The roads themselves, built to Roman engineering standards that prioritised durability and all-weather accessibility, provided rapid movement routes for Roman reinforcements while facilitating the supply operations that sustained extended campaigns in hostile territory. More significantly, the systematic destruction of forest cover required for road construction eliminated the concealment that had made Silurian guerrilla tactics so effective. Graticus's transformation from traditional tribal king to resistance leader reflected both his personal adaptability and his understanding of the broader political dynamics that Roman conquest had created throughout Britain. His success in uniting not only the Silures, but also elements of the Ordovices and other Welsh tribes demonstrated political skills that went beyond the personal charisma typically associated with Celtic leadership. The establishment of coordinated resistance across multiple tribal territories required diplomatic arrangements that transcended traditional rivalries while creating military structures capable of sustaining prolonged warfare against imperial forces. His ability to maintain these coalitions despite the pressures of constant military action and the temptations of Roman diplomatic overtures testified to leadership qualities that Roman observers grudgingly acknowledged. The tactical innovations that emerged from the Welsh campaigns influenced Roman military thinking throughout the empire, providing lessons that proved applicable to frontier warfare in diverse geographical settings. The integration of auxiliary forces with legionary formations, initially developed as an expedient for Welsh conditions, became standard practice that enhanced Roman tactical flexibility while reducing the casualty rates that had threatened to make British conquest economically unsustainable. The emphasis on engineering operations as military weapons, demonstrated through road construction and fort building in hostile territory, established precedents that shaped Roman frontier policy for generations. Most significantly, the recognition that successful pacification required economic as well as military pressure led to systematic efforts to disrupt British agricultural and commercial activities that sustained resistance movements. The siege of Caraticus's stronghold in 51 AD represented the culmination of Scapula's systematic campaign to eliminate organised British resistance in Wales. The fortification itself positioned on a hilltop that commanded approaches from multiple directions, incorporated both traditional British defensive techniques and innovations that reflected years of observation of Roman siege methods. Multiple defensive lines, constructed with interlocking fields of fire that maximised the effectiveness of British archery, created obstacles that required systematic reduction through Roman engineering rather than simple assault. The presence of non-combatant populations within the defensive perimeter, including women and children from multiple tribal groups, demonstrated the extent to which the stronghold had become a symbol of British resistance, rather than merely a military position. Roman siege techniques, refined through generations of Mediterranean warfare, required significant adaptation to overcome defences that had been specifically designed to counter imperial military methods. The construction of circumvallation works around the British position, while following established Roman engineering principles, demanded modifications that addressed the unique topographical challenges of Welsh terrain. The deployment of artillery against fortifications that incorporated natural rock formations rather than constructed walls required tactical innovations that pushed Roman siege warfare beyond its traditional parameters. The systematic reduction of outer defensive lines through coordinated infantry assaults supported by engineering operations demonstrated Roman military professionalism while revealing the tactical competence of British defensive preparations. The capture of Caractacus during the final assault eliminated the most effective British resistance leader, while providing Rome with a symbolic victory that justified the enormous costs of Welsh pacification. His betrayal by Cartimandua, Queen of the Brigantes, reflected the complex political calculations that governed British tribal relationships under Roman pressure, demonstrating how imperial diplomatic strategies could exploit existing rivalries to achieve the military objectives that direct force alone might not accomplish. The circumstances of his capture, fleeing northward after the fall of his stronghold, only to be handed over by a supposed ally, provided Roman propagandists with material that emphasized both the futility of resistance and the reliability of Roman-client relationships. The transportation of Caractacus to Rome for Claudius's triumph represented a carefully orchestrated demonstration of imperial power that served multiple political purposes simultaneously. For Roman audiences, the presence of the famous British war leader in chains provided tangible evidence of imperial military success, while justifying the resources that British conquest had consumed. For British observers, the spectacle demonstrated the ultimate fate that awaited those who continued to resist Roman authority while offering examples of the honours that submission could bring. The speech attributed to Caractacus before the Senate, whether authentic or constructed by Roman historians, established literary precedents that influenced subsequent accounts of barbarian nobility, while providing moral lessons about the relationship between resistance and accommodation within imperial structures. The continuation of Silurian resistance following Caractacus's capture revealed the extent to which British opposition to Roman rule had evolved beyond dependence on individual leadership towards systematic resistance movements that could survive the loss of prominent figures. The tribal confederation that had formed around Caractacus maintained its organisational structure and tactical effectiveness, despite the removal of its most visible leader, suggesting that British military culture had adapted to Roman pressures in ways that created sustainable resistance capabilities. The persistence of guerrilla warfare throughout the Welsh mountains, continuing for years after the elimination of organised British leadership, demonstrated that pacification would require more than military victory over identifiable enemy forces. Scapula's death in 52 AD, attributed by Roman sources to the stresses of continuous campaigning, illustrated the personal costs that British resistance imposed on imperial commanders, while creating opportunities for British forces to exploit the transition between governors. The interregnum period, during which military operations continued under subordinate commanders, pending the arrival of Scapula's replacement, revealed both the institutional strength of Roman military administration and the tactical awareness of British resistance movements that recognised opportunities to inflict maximum damage during periods of uncertain Roman leadership. The escalation of Silurian attacks during this transitional period demonstrated strategic thinking that went beyond simple opportunism towards systematic exploitation of Roman administrative vulnerabilities. The appointment of Aulus Didius Gallus as Scapula's successor reflected imperial recognition that British pacification required different approaches than those that had proven effective during the initial conquest period. Gallus's background in civilian administration, rather than purely military command, suggested that Claudius understood the need for governmental consolidation rather than continued territorial expansion. His instructions emphasized the stabilization of existing Roman positions rather than aggressive pursuit of remaining resistance movements, marking a strategic shift that acknowledged the practical limitations of Roman military resources while recognizing the need for sustainable provincial administration. The northern frontier during this period presented challenges that differed significantly from those encountered in Wales, reflecting both the different tribal structures of British peoples beyond Roman control and the strategic importance of maintaining client relationships that could provide security without requiring direct military occupation. The Brigantes, under Queen Cartimandua's leadership, controlled territories that extended from the Humber to the Scottish borders, encompassing populations and resources that made their alliance essential for Roman strategic planning. However, the internal divisions within Brigantian society, exacerbated by Cartimandua's pro-Roman policies and her personal relationship with her armor-bearer Velicatus, created instabilities that threatened to draw Roman forces into conflicts that could destabilize the entire northern frontier. The marital and political crisis within the Brigantian royal house reflected broader tensions between traditional British political structures and the demands of Roman client relationships. Cartimandua's divorce from her husband Venutius and her subsequent marriage to Velicatus violated traditional British succession practices while creating rival claimants to Brigantian leadership that Roman diplomacy would need to manage. Venutius's opposition to his former wife's pro-Roman policies provided a focus for anti-Roman sentiment throughout northern Britain while creating military threats that could potentially unite tribes that had previously remained divided. The Roman decision to support Cartimandua through direct military intervention demonstrated imperial commitment to client relationships, while revealing the extent to which British internal politics had become entangled with Roman strategic interests. The deployment of Roman auxiliary forces to maintain Cartimandua's authority against internal opposition marked a significant expansion of imperial military commitments, while establishing precedents for intervention in client kingdom affairs that would influence Roman provincial policy throughout the empire. The success of these operations, which maintained Brigantian loyalty without requiring full-scale military conquest, demonstrated the effectiveness of Roman diplomatic strategies when supported by credible military force. However, the resources required to sustain these interventions, including the permanent stationing of Roman troops within nominally independent territories, illustrated the hidden costs of client relationships that appeared less expensive than direct administration. The arrival of Suetonius Paulinus as governor in 58 AD brought to Britain a commander whose North African experience had demonstrated his capacity for the systematic warfare necessary to complete British pacification. His background in desert campaigns against Moorish tribes had provided tactical knowledge that proved applicable to the guerrilla warfare that continued to plague Roman operations in Wales, while his reputation for ruthless efficiency suggested that imperial policy had shifted toward more aggressive approaches to resistance movements. Paulinus's instructions apparently emphasized the elimination of remaining centers of British resistance rather than the defensive consolidation that had characterized his predecessor's tenure. The decision to assault Mona represented both a strategic calculation and a symbolic statement that demonstrated Roman understanding of the religious and political factors that sustained British resistance to imperial rule. The island's role as the primary centre of Druidical activity throughout Britain made it a natural focus for anti-Roman sentiment, while providing organisational capabilities that could coordinate resistance movements across tribal boundaries. The presence of refugees from conquered territories, including members of tribal nobility and religious specialists, had transformed Mona into something approaching a British government in exile that posed ideological threats to Roman authority that went beyond simple military resistance. The practical challenges of mounting an amphibious assault against Mona tested Roman military capabilities in ways that recalled Caesar's original invasion, while requiring tactical innovations that addressed the specific conditions of Irish sea warfare. The construction of flat-bottom boats capable of navigating tidal waters while carrying cavalry and siege equipment demanded engineering skills that pushed Roman shipbuilding beyond its established parameters. The coordination of land and sea operations across the Menai Strait required logistical planning that integrated multiple military specialties while maintaining operational security against opponents who possessed intimate knowledge of local geographical conditions. The assault itself, launched in 60 AD, demonstrated Roman military professionalism at its most effective, while revealing the psychological factors that had made druidical resistance so persistent throughout the conquest period. The British defenders, including both warriors and religious personnel, employed ritual practices designed to intimidate Roman attackers while calling upon supernatural assistance that their religious traditions promised would defeat foreign invaders. The presence of women among the defenders, described by Roman sources as furies brandishing torches and uttering curses, created psychological pressures that tested Roman military discipline in ways that conventional warfare had not. The systematic nature of Roman tactical procedures, however, overcame these psychological challenges through the disciplined application of proven military techniques. The destruction of the sacred groves and the slaughter of the druidical priesthood that followed the successful assault represented a deliberate attempt to eliminate the ideological foundations of British resistance, while demonstrating Roman power over the supernatural forces that British religious traditions claimed protected the island. The systematic burning of religious sites, the destruction of ritual objects, and the execution of religious personnel created symbolic victories that were intended to demonstrate to British populations throughout the island that their traditional sources of spiritual protection were powerless against Roman military might. The thoroughness of this destruction, which eliminated centuries of accumulated religious tradition, marked a turning point in Romano-British relations that went beyond simple military conquest toward cultural transformation. The news of Boudicca's rebellion, which reached Paulinus while he was consolidating Roman control over Mona, created the most serious crisis that Roman rule in Britain had yet faced, while demonstrating the extent to which imperial administrative policies had created grievances that could unite previously divided British populations. The immediate cause of the uprising lay in Roman mishandling of Iceni succession arrangements following the death of King Prasutagus, whose will had attempted to balance British tribal traditions with Roman legal requirements by dividing his kingdom between his daughters and the Roman emperor. The Roman rejection of this arrangement, combined with the brutal treatment of Boudicca and her daughters by imperial officials, provided the personal grievances that transformed localized discontent into systematic rebellion. The broader causes of the uprising reflected systematic problems in Roman provincial administration that had developed during the 17 years since the initial conquest. The financial pressures created by Seneca's recall of loans that had been extended to British tribal leaders during the conquest period created economic hardships that affected multiple tribal groups simultaneously. The cultural insensitivity demonstrated by Roman officials, particularly in their treatment of British religious practices and traditional legal arrangements, had generated resentment that transcended tribal boundaries, while creating common cause among populations that had previously remained divided. The military recruitment policies that had drawn young British men into auxiliary service while leaving their communities vulnerable to economic exploitation had created demographic imbalances that contributed to social instability. The rapid spread of the rebellion beyond Iceni territory demonstrated both the effectiveness of British communication networks and the extent of anti-Roman sentiment that imperial policies had generated throughout eastern Britain. The Trinovantes, despite their early submission to Roman authority and their apparent integration into imperial administrative structures, joined the uprising with enthusiasm that suggested their loyalty had been superficial rather than genuine. The participation of elements from other tribal groups, including some that had previously maintained client relationships with Rome, revealed the fragility of the political arrangements that Roman diplomacy had constructed during the conquest period. The assault on Camulodunum represented both a practical military objective and a symbolic strike against the most visible manifestation of Roman authority in Britain. The colony established at the former Catuvellauni capital had become a focus for British resentment due to the systematic appropriation of tribal lands for veteran settlement and the construction of the temple dedicated to Claudius that served as a permanent reminder of imperial conquest. The inadequate military defences of the settlement, which had been designed more for administrative convenience than military security, reflected Roman confidence in the stability of their British conquests, while demonstrating the extent to which imperial complacency had created vulnerabilities that British resistance could exploit. The destruction of the colony proceeded with systematic thoroughness that demonstrated both British military capabilities and the depth of resentment that Roman policies had generated among conquered populations. The massacre of Roman civilians, including women and children, created casualty levels that shocked imperial observers, while providing British forces with psychological victories that encouraged continued resistance. The burning of public buildings, particularly the temple that had symbolised Roman religious dominance, created powerful symbolic statements that resonated throughout British territories, while demonstrating that Roman authority was not invulnerable to determined opposition. The accession of Vespasian to imperial power in 69 AD marked a fundamental transformation in Roman strategic thinking about Britain, moving beyond the defensive consolidation that had characterised the post-Boudiccan period towards systematic expansion that would extend imperial control to the island's northernmost reaches. Vespasian's personal experience as a legionary commander during the Claudian conquest had provided him with intimate knowledge of British conditions and military capabilities, while his pragmatic approach to imperial administration emphasised the economic benefits that complete territorial control could provide. The appointment of Quintus Petilius Cerialis as governor in 71 AD signalled this strategic shift, bringing to Britain a commander whose recent success in suppressing the Batavian revolt had demonstrated his capacity for the aggressive warfare that northern expansion would require. Cerialis' initial campaigns against the Brigantes represented the culmination of decades of Roman frustration with the instabilities that had plagued the northern frontier since Cartimandua's overthrow by her former husband Venutius. The Brigantian Confederation, controlling territories that stretched from the Humber to the Cheviot Hills, had devolved into a complex patchwork of competing factions whose shifting allegiances created constant security threats while denying Rome the stable client relationship that northern frontier defence required. Venutius's victory over his pro-Roman former wife had eliminated the political arrangements that had maintained peace since the conquest, replacing them with an aggressively anti-Roman leadership that actively encouraged resistance movements throughout northern Britain. The military challenges that Brigantian territory presented differed significantly from those that Roman forces had encountered in Wales or southern Britain, reflecting both the distinctive geographical characteristics of northern England and the tactical adaptations that decades of intermittent warfare had produced among British populations. The Pennine spine that dominated Brigantian territory created natural defensive positions that could channel Roman advances into predictable routes, while providing British forces with observation points that made tactical surprise virtually impossible. The extensive moorlands that covered much of the region offered concealment for British raiders, while presenting logistical challenges that stretched Roman supply capabilities beyond their established parameters. Cerialis' response to these challenges demonstrated tactical innovations that would influence Roman frontier warfare throughout the empire, emphasising rapid movement and multiple simultaneous advances that prevented British forces from concentrating their defensive efforts. The deployment of 3 legions along converging axes of advance created tactical pressures that Brigantian forces could not counter simultaneously, while maintaining the mutual support that Roman military doctrine required for operations in hostile territory. Legio IX Hispana advanced northward from Lincoln along the eastern coastal plain, exploiting the relatively open terrain that provided ideal conditions for Roman cavalry operations, while maintaining supply lines that could be supported by naval transport. Legio II Adjutrix moved through the central Pennines, constructing roads and establishing fortified positions that provided permanent bases for subsequent operations, while demonstrating Roman commitment to permanent occupation rather than temporary raiding. The systematic construction of Roman roads through Brigantian territory represented both a logistical necessity and a strategic weapon that gradually transformed the tactical balance in favour of imperial forces. These engineering projects, executed by legionary specialists working under constant security provided by auxiliary cohorts, required massive labour inputs that demonstrated Roman organisational capabilities while creating permanent infrastructure that would support continued military operations. The roads themselves, built to Roman engineering standards that prioritised all-weather accessibility and rapid troop movement, eliminated the geographical advantages that had previously favoured British defensive strategies while providing Roman commanders with tactical flexibility that British resistance could not counter. The establishment of Roman fortifications at strategic locations throughout conquered Brigantian territory created a network of mutually supporting strongholds that could respond rapidly to British resistance while providing secure bases for continued northward expansion. The fortress constructed at Eboracum represented the most significant of these installations, positioned at the confluence of the Ouse and Foss rivers to control river traffic while commanding the approaches to northern England from multiple directions. The site's selection reflected both tactical considerations and long-term strategic planning, providing a location that could serve as the administrative and military centre for northern operations, while offering the river access necessary for supply operations that would sustain extended campaigns beyond the established frontier. The fortress design incorporated lessons learned from decades of British warfare while addressing the specific requirements of operations in northern terrain that differed significantly from Mediterranean conditions. The defensive perimeter, constructed with stone foundations and timber superstructures that could be rapidly repaired under hostile conditions, provided protection against British assault techniques while maintaining the internal organisation necessary for efficient military administration. The inclusion of specialised facilities for cavalry operations, siege equipment storage, and auxiliary unit accommodation reflected Roman understanding that northern expansion would require combined arms operations that integrated multiple military specialties under unified command. The pacification of remaining Brigantian resistance required tactical approaches that addressed both military and political dimensions of British opposition to Roman rule. Cerealis' systematic destruction of hill forts throughout the region eliminated the defensive positions that had sustained British resistance while demonstrating Roman military capabilities to populations that had previously remained beyond direct imperial control. The relocation of British populations from fortified hilltop settlements to open valley locations facilitated Roman administrative oversight while disrupting the social structures that had supported anti-Roman political organisation. These population movements, while creating short-term hardships for affected British communities, provided Roman authorities with opportunities to implement the cultural and economic changes that would integrate conquered territories into imperial administrative systems. The appointment of Julius Frontinus as Cerealis' successor in 74 AD brought to Britain a commander whose engineering expertise and systematic approach to military operations would prove essential for the completion of Welsh pacification that had remained incomplete, despite decades of Roman military effort. Frontinus's background in hydraulic engineering and urban planning provided technical skills that complemented his military experience while offering administrative capabilities that would prove valuable in organising conquered territories for effective provincial governance. His instructions emphasised the elimination of remaining resistance centres in Wales, while establishing the infrastructure necessary to support subsequent northward expansion into Scotland. The systematic reduction of Silurian strongholds that had continued to resist Roman authority represented the culmination of military techniques that had evolved through generations of British warfare. Frontinus's forces employed coordinated siege operations that integrated legionary assault capabilities with auxiliary specialties, while utilising engineering techniques that had been refined through Mediterranean siege warfare and adapted to British conditions. The construction of circumvallation works around British fortifications, combined with the systematic destruction of agricultural resources that sustained resistance movements, created tactical pressures that British defensive strategies could not counter indefinitely. The establishment of the legionary fortress at Isca provided Roman forces in Wales with a permanent base that could support continued operations while demonstrating imperial commitment to maintaining control over territories that had cost enormous resources to conquer. The fortress location, positioned on the River Usk to provide water access while commanding the approaches to southeastern Wales, reflected strategic planning that integrated immediate tactical requirements with long-term administrative needs. The construction employed Roman engineering techniques that had been adapted to Welsh conditions while incorporating defensive features that addressed the specific challenges of maintaining security in mountainous terrain that continued to shelter British resistance movements. The cultural impact of Roman military presence in Wales extended beyond simple territorial control towards systematic transformation of British social and economic structures that had sustained resistance for decades. The construction of Roman roads, bathhouses, and administrative buildings introduced Mediterranean urban concepts, while providing employment opportunities that gradually integrated British populations into imperial economic systems. The establishment of markets and commercial centres created economic incentives for peaceful cooperation, while demonstrating the material benefits that Roman civilization could provide to populations that abandoned resistance in favour of collaboration. The arrival of Gnaeus Julius Agricola as governor in 78 AD marked the beginning of the most systematic and ambitious expansion of Roman control in British history, bringing to the province a commander whose combination of military experience, administrative competence, and political acumen would transform imperial strategy from defensive consolidation to aggressive conquest. Agricola's background included previous service in Britain as a military tribune during Boudicca's rebellion and as legionary commander under Cerealis, providing him with intimate knowledge of British conditions and tactical requirements that few Roman commanders possessed. His appointment reflected Vespasian's confidence in his abilities while signalling imperial commitment to completing the conquest that had remained incomplete for nearly 4 decades. Agricola's initial assessment of British conditions revealed both the achievements and limitations of previous Roman governors, while identifying opportunities for systematic expansion that had been neglected due to political instabilities and resource constraints. The southern and central regions of Britain had achieved a level of Romanisation that provided secure bases for military operations while generating tax revenues that could support continued expansion. The client kingdoms that had survived the conquest period continued to provide buffer zones against unconquered territories while offering intelligence and logistical support that reduced the costs of frontier operations. Most significantly, the military infrastructure that previous governors had constructed provided the foundation for systematic northward advance that could extend Roman control beyond the limits that geographical and political constraints had previously imposed. The strategic plan that emerged from Agricola's analysis emphasized coordinated land and sea operations that would exploit Roman naval capabilities while maintaining the systematic approach that had proven successful in previous British campaigns. The construction of a fleet capable of operating in Scottish coastal waters provided tactical flexibility that purely land-based operations could not achieve, while offering logistical capabilities that could support extended campaigns beyond the reach of established supply lines. The integration of naval and land forces under unified command represented tactical innovation that addressed the specific geographical challenges of Scottish conquest, while maximising the advantages that Roman military organisation provided over British resistance movements. Agricola's first campaign season, launched in 79 AD, demonstrated the systematic approach that would characterise his entire governorship, while achieving territorial gains that exceeded those of any previous Roman commander in Britain. The advance into Caledonia proceeded along multiple axes that prevented British forces from concentrating their defensive efforts while maintaining mutual support between different Roman columns. The eastern advance, following coastal routes that could be supported by naval transport, achieved rapid territorial gains while establishing secure supply lines that could sustain continued operations. The central advance, moving through the river valleys that provided natural invasion routes, constructed permanent fortifications that could serve as bases for subsequent campaigns, while demonstrating Roman commitment to permanent occupation rather than temporary raiding. The British response to Roman invasion revealed both the military capabilities and political limitations that characterised Scottish tribal society at the end of the 1st century AD. The Caledonii, who emerged as the primary opponents of Roman expansion, possessed military traditions that had evolved through generations of intertribal warfare, while maintaining political structures that could coordinate resistance across extensive territories. Their tactical employment of guerrilla warfare, utilising intimate knowledge of local geography to harass Roman supply lines while avoiding decisive engagements, demonstrated strategic thinking that had learned from the failures of southern British resistance movements. The systematic destruction of Roman supply depots and the targeting of isolated Roman detachments revealed military planning that went beyond simple opportunism toward coordinated strategy designed to make Roman occupation economically unsustainable. The construction of Roman fortifications throughout conquered Scottish territory created a network of mutually supporting positions that could maintain control over extensive areas while providing secure bases for continued northward advance. The fortress established at Inchtutil, positioned to control the approaches to the Central Highlands, represented the northernmost permanent Roman installation in Britain while demonstrating the extent of Agricola's territorial ambitions. The site selection reflected both immediate tactical requirements and long-term strategic planning, providing a location that could serve as the administrative centre for Scottish operations while offering the river access necessary for supply operations that would sustain Roman presence in territories that lay hundreds of miles beyond established provincial boundaries. The systematic nature of Roman road construction in Scotland demonstrated engineering capabilities that impressed even hostile British observers, while creating infrastructure that would support continued military operations regardless of seasonal conditions. These roads, built to Roman standards that prioritised durability and all-weather accessibility, required massive labour inputs that were provided by both Roman military engineers and British populations that had been pressed into service following their conquest. The speed of construction, which created hundreds of miles of paved roads within a few campaign seasons, reflected organisational capabilities that British tribal society could not match, while demonstrating Roman commitment to permanent occupation that went beyond simple military raiding. The climactic confrontation between Roman and British forces occurred at Mont Scraupius in 83 AD, where Agricola's systematic campaign strategy finally forced the Caledonii into the decisive engagement that Roman tactical doctrine was designed to win. The British army, assembled under the leadership of Calgacus, represented the largest concentration of Scottish warriors that had ever been achieved, drawing contingents from tribes throughout the Highlands in a final attempt to halt Roman expansion through military victory rather than continued guerrilla resistance. The battle site selected by British commanders to maximise their tactical advantages while minimising Roman superiority in siege warfare and engineering, provided terrain that favoured the mobility and local knowledge that had sustained Scottish resistance throughout the campaign. Tacitus's account of the battle, based on information provided by his father-in-law Agricola, described tactical arrangements that demonstrated both Roman military professionalism and British adaptation to imperial warfare techniques. The Roman deployment, featuring auxiliary cohorts in the front line, supported by legionary reserves, reflected tactical innovations that had evolved through decades of British warfare, while maintaining the systematic approach that characterised imperial military doctrine. The British formation, employing massed infantry supported by chariot-borne nobles, represented traditional Scottish military organisation while incorporating tactical modifications that addressed Roman military capabilities. The preliminary exchanges, featuring British chariots attempting to disrupt Roman formations through mobility attacks, demonstrated the tactical problems that had plagued British resistance throughout the conquest period, while revealing the limitations of traditional Celtic warfare against systematic Roman military procedures. The victory at Mons Graupius had seemingly secured Roman dominion over the entirety of Britain, yet within a decade the strategic landscape had shifted so dramatically that the Emperor Hadrian himself would journey to this distant province to personally oversee the construction of the most ambitious frontier fortification in Roman history. The withdrawal from Scotland, initiated under Domitian's cost-cutting measures and accelerated by Trajan's eastern campaigns, had created a power vacuum that Scottish tribes were quick to exploit. The Caledoni, far from being permanently subdued by their battlefield defeat, had regrouped in the highland fastnesses that Roman logistics could never effectively penetrate, while the systematic abandonment of Agricola's northern fortifications provided them with ready-made strongholds and vast quantities of abandoned military equipment. The strategic situation that confronted Roman commanders in northern Britain during the early 2nd century represented a fundamental challenge to imperial military doctrine. The traditional Roman approach to frontier management, which relied on client kingdoms buffering the provinces from barbarian territories, had proven unworkable in Scotland, where tribal political structures remained too fragmented and hostile to sustain reliable diplomatic relationships. The alternative strategy of direct military occupation, successfully implemented throughout most of the empire, had proven economically unsustainable in territories where the costs of maintaining permanent garrisons exceeded any conceivable returns from taxation or resource extraction. The result was a dangerous frontier zone where neither Roman authority nor British independence could establish stable control, creating conditions that threatened the security of the entire northern region. Hadrian's arrival in Britain during the summer of 122 AD brought to the province an emperor whose personal involvement in frontier affairs reflected both his systematic approach to imperial administration and his recognition that British conditions required solutions that went beyond conventional military responses. His extensive travels throughout the empire had provided him with comparative knowledge of frontier problems from the Rhine to the Euphrates, while his background in military engineering offered technical expertise that proved essential for developing the unprecedented fortification system that would bear his name. The emperor's decision to spend several months in Britain, personally supervising the initial stages of wall construction, demonstrated imperial commitment to British security, while providing the political authority necessary to mobilise the enormous resources that the project would require. The strategic concept underlying Hadrian's Wall represented a radical departure from traditional Roman frontier policy, abandoning attempts to extend direct control over hostile territories in favour of creating an impermeable barrier that would separate the civilised province from barbarian lands beyond. This approach acknowledged practical limitations that Roman military capabilities could not overcome, while maximising the advantages that Roman engineering and organisational skills provided over less sophisticated opponents. The wall would serve simultaneously as a military fortification, an administrative boundary, and a symbolic statement of imperial power that would demonstrate Roman capabilities to both friendly and hostile populations throughout the region. The selection of the wall's route reflected detailed reconnaissance that had identified the optimal line for balancing defensive effectiveness with construction feasibility across the varied terrain of northern England. The eastern terminus at Wallsend provided access to river transport, while controlling the approaches to the Tyne Valley that offered the most direct invasion route toward the province's heartland. The western section, extending to Bowness on Solway, utilised the natural defensive barrier of the Solway Firth while maintaining control over the coastal routes that Scottish raiders had previously used to bypass Roman defensive positions. The central section, following the dramatic escarpment of the Windsill, exploited natural geographical advantages that multiplied the wall's defensive effectiveness while creating the most visually impressive section of the entire fortification. The engineering specifications for Hadrian's Wall demonstrated Roman construction capabilities at their most ambitious, requiring technical innovations that addressed the unique challenges of building a continuous fortification across 73 miles of diverse terrain. The eastern sections, constructed entirely of stone, featured walls 8 feet thick and 16 feet high, topped with crenellated battlements that provided protected positions for defenders, while creating an imposing visual barrier that could be seen for miles across the surrounding countryside. The facing stones, carefully dressed and fitted without mortar, created surfaces that would resist weathering for centuries while requiring construction techniques that demanded skilled craftsmen drawn from throughout the empire. The core, filled with rubble and concrete, provided structural integrity that could withstand both natural settling and deliberate assault, while utilising local materials that reduced transportation costs. The western sections of the wall, initially constructed of turf and timber before being rebuilt in stone, reflected both practical considerations and evolving strategic requirements that modified the original construction plans. The turf wall, built to the same height as the stone sections but with a 20-foot base width, necessary for structural stability, demonstrated Roman adaptability to local conditions where suitable stone was unavailable or transportation costs were prohibitive. The timber palisade that crowned the turf rampart provided defensive capabilities equivalent to stone construction, while requiring construction techniques that could be executed by military engineers without specialised masonry skills. The subsequent reconstruction in stone, undertaken during the later years of Hadrian's reign, created structural uniformity while providing employment for British labourers whose skills had been developed during the initial construction phase. The mile castle system that punctuated the wall at regular intervals created a network of fortified positions that could accommodate small garrisons, while providing secure sally ports for offensive operations against raiders who attempted to breach the frontier. These installations, numbered sequentially from east to west, featured standardized designs that incorporated both accommodation for soldiers and facilities for controlling civilian traffic through the frontier zone. The internal buildings, constructed around central courtyards that provided protected assembly areas, included barracks for 8 to 16 soldiers, granaries for storing supplies, and administrative offices for managing the complex bureaucratic procedures that frontier control required. The gateways, protected by massive oak doors reinforced with iron fittings, could be sealed against assault while providing controlled access for merchants, diplomats, and other authorised personnel whose business required passage through the frontier. The turret system that filled the intervals between mile castles created observation points that maintained visual surveillance over the entire length of the wall, while providing secure positions for small detachments of soldiers whose primary responsibility was early warning rather than active defence. These installations, positioned at 1/3 mile intervals to ensure overlapping fields of observation, featured stone construction that matched the adjacent wall sections, while providing accommodation for 2 to 4 soldiers on rotating duty assignments. The internal arrangements, necessarily compact due to space limitations, included sleeping quarters, equipment storage, and beacon positions for signalling systems that could transmit messages along the entire length of the wall within hours of initial observation. The systematic spacing of these installations created a surveillance network that made clandestine frontier crossing virtually impossible while providing Roman commanders with detailed intelligence about Scottish activities beyond the wall. The construction workforce assembled for the wall project represented one of the largest engineering undertakings in Roman military history, requiring coordination between multiple legions, auxiliary units, and civilian contractors whose combined efforts would transform the northern English landscape over nearly 2 decades of continuous construction. Legio II Augusta, Legio VI Victrix, and Legio Theta Valeria Victrix provided the primary construction forces, each responsible for specific sections whose completion became matters of unit pride and competitive achievement. The legionary engineers, trained in military construction techniques that emphasized speed and durability over architectural refinement, adapted their standard procedures to address the unique challenges of wall construction, while maintaining the systematic approaches that characterized Roman military engineering. The auxiliary cohorts, drawn from throughout the empire, provided specialized skills that complemented legionary capabilities while offering cultural and linguistic knowledge that proved valuable in managing British labour forces. The logistical requirements for wall construction created supply networks that stretched across the entire province, while demonstrating Roman organisational capabilities on an unprecedented scale. Stone quarries, opened at strategic locations along the wall's route, provided the millions of tons of building material that construction required, while creating permanent scars on the landscape that testified to the project's enormous scale. The transportation of this material, accomplished through combinations of river transport, ox-drawn wagons and human porterage, required road construction and improvement projects that enhanced provincial infrastructure while providing employment for British populations whose traditional economic activities had been disrupted by Roman occupation. The lime kilns that produced mortar for stone construction, the timber operations that provided scaffolding and construction equipment, and the metalworking facilities that manufactured tools and hardware all created economic activity that integrated wall construction into the broader provincial economy. The garrison arrangements for the completed wall reflected strategic thinking that balanced defensive effectiveness with administrative efficiency while addressing the complex requirements of frontier control that went beyond simple military security. The major forts constructed along the wall, including Housesteads, Birdoswald and Chesters, accommodated auxiliary cohorts whose specialised capabilities complemented the wall's defensive systems while providing the manpower necessary for active patrolling and offensive operations. These installations, built to standardised designs that incorporated lessons learned from decades of frontier warfare, featured defensive perimeters that could withstand sustained assault while maintaining the internal organisation necessary for efficient military administration. The headquarters buildings, constructed around central courtyards that served as parade grounds and assembly areas, housed the administrative apparatus that managed the complex bureaucratic procedures required for frontier control. The civilian settlements that developed outside the major forts created economic and social communities that supported military operations, while providing services that soldiers required but military organisation could not efficiently provide. These vici, featuring timber and stone construction that reflected both Roman architectural influences and local building traditions, included taverns, bathhouses, shops, and workshops that created civilian economies dependent on military spending while providing recreational facilities that enhanced soldier morale and retention. The presence of women and children in these communities, including soldiers' wives and families whose legal status remained ambiguous under Roman military law, created social complexities that required administrative flexibility while demonstrating the extent to which frontier service had evolved beyond the temporary campaigning that had characterised earlier Roman military operations. The economic impact of the wall's construction and maintenance created fundamental changes in northern British society that extended far beyond the immediate construction zones while integrating previously independent tribal populations into imperial economic systems. The demand for labour during construction phases provided employment opportunities that drew workers from throughout northern England, while introducing Roman construction techniques and organisational methods that influenced local building traditions for generations. The ongoing maintenance requirements, including stone replacement, timber renewal, and facility upgrades, created permanent employment that supported British communities while ensuring that Roman defensive capabilities remained effective, despite the natural deterioration that affected all frontier installations. The wall's impact on local British populations reflected both the opportunities and restrictions that Roman frontier control created for communities that found themselves living in the shadow of imperial power. The agricultural communities south of the wall benefited from security that allowed normal farming activities, while providing markets for surplus production that military garrisons required. The restriction of movement across the frontier, however, disrupted traditional trade relationships and seasonal migration patterns that had sustained British economic activities for generations. The result was a gradual reorientation of local economies toward Roman markets and Roman administrative requirements that created dependencies on imperial systems, while offering material benefits that made accommodation preferable to resistance. The strategic effectiveness of Hadrian's Wall as a frontier barrier exceeded Roman expectations, while creating tactical advantages that transformed the military balance throughout northern Britain. The physical obstacle that the wall presented to Scottish raiders eliminated the surprise attacks that had previously made frontier defence so difficult, while channeling any attempted invasions into predictable crossing points where Roman forces could concentrate their defensive efforts. The intelligence advantages that continuous surveillance provided allowed Roman commanders to anticipate Scottish movements, while coordinating responses that could intercept raiders before they could inflict significant damage on provincial territories. The psychological impact of the wall's imposing presence demonstrated Roman power, while discouraging casual raiding that had previously been a constant source of frontier instability. The decision to construct the Antonine Wall during the 140 SAD represented both an ambitious attempt to extend Roman control northward and a fundamental misunderstanding of the strategic factors that had made Hadrian's Wall successful. Antoninus Pius's desire to achieve military glory through territorial expansion, combined with optimistic assessments of Scottish tribal weakness following decades of Roman pressure, led to the construction of a second frontier barrier 39 miles long between the Forth and Clyde estuaries. This new fortification, built primarily of turf and timber rather than stone, reflected both the temporary nature of its intended occupation and the reduced resources available for frontier construction during a period when imperial attention was focused on other regions. The Antonine Wall's construction demonstrated Roman engineering capabilities while revealing the limitations of extending frontier control beyond sustainable limits. The shorter length of the new barrier, made possible by Scotland's narrower width at the Forth Clyde line, reduced construction requirements while creating a more compact defensive perimeter that could theoretically be held with fewer troops. The incorporation of larger forts at closer intervals reflected lessons learned from Hadrian's Wall, while addressing the specific challenges of controlling territories where Scottish tribal resistance remained active and organised. The road network constructed to support the new frontier provided rapid communication and reinforcement capabilities, while demonstrating Roman commitment to permanent occupation of the advanced position. The abandonment of the Antonine Wall after less than 20 years of occupation illustrated the practical limitations that constrained Roman frontier policy, while demonstrating the superior strategic value of Hadrian's more southern barrier. The costs of maintaining garrisons in territories that remained fundamentally hostile exceeded any economic or strategic benefits that advanced positions could provide, while the extended supply lines required to support the northern frontier created vulnerabilities that Scottish resistance movements could exploit. The withdrawal to Hadrian's Wall, completed by 164 AD, represented not military defeat, but strategic realism that acknowledged the practical limits of Roman expansion, while concentrating defensive resources on positions that could be held indefinitely. The frontier system that emerged from these experiences created a stable boundary between Roman and Scottish territories that would persist for nearly 3 centuries, while demonstrating the effectiveness of defensive strategies that emphasised barrier construction over territorial expansion. Hadrian's Wall became not merely a military fortification, but a symbol of Roman engineering achievement and imperial determination that influenced frontier policy throughout the empire. The communities that developed in the wall's shadow, both military and civilian, created cultural syntheses that combined Roman administrative practices with British local traditions, while maintaining the security arrangements that protected the province's northern territories from external threat. The transformation of Britain from a collection of Iron Age tribal territories into a functioning Roman province required far more than military conquest and administrative reorganisation. The process of Romanisation that unfolded across the 1st and 2nd centuries AD represented a complex cultural negotiation between imperial expectations and local traditions, creating hybrid Romano-British identities that would define provincial life for the next 3 centuries. This transformation was neither uniform nor complete, varying significantly across different regions and social classes, while reflecting the practical realities of governing a distant province whose Celtic foundations remained stubbornly persistent beneath the veneer of classical civilization. The British elite's adoption of Roman customs began almost immediately following the Claudian conquest, driven by a combination of political necessity, economic opportunity, and genuine attraction to Mediterranean cultural achievements. Tribal leaders who'd submitted to Roman authority during the conquest period found themselves navigating a complex social landscape where traditional sources of prestige competed with new forms of status that Roman civilization offered. The construction of Roman-style villas by wealthy Britons represented more than architectural fashion. It demonstrated their understanding that survival and prosperity within the imperial system required visible adoption of Roman cultural markers that would signal their reliability to provincial administrators, while maintaining their authority over British populations who remained sceptical of foreign innovations. The villa at Fishbourne, constructed for the client king Cogidubnus during the 70s AD, exemplified the sophisticated architectural synthesis that emerged when British wealth encountered Roman design principles. The complex covered nearly 6 acres, featuring formal gardens that introduced Mediterranean horticultural techniques to British soil, while incorporating decorative elements that reflected both classical artistic traditions and local Celtic motifs. The central courtyard, surrounded by colonnaded walkways that provided protection from British weather, while maintaining the open-air aesthetic that Roman domestic architecture required, demonstrated how imperial building standards could be adapted to Northern European conditions without sacrificing their essential character. The hypocaust heating system that warmed the principal rooms represented technological innovation that transformed British concepts of domestic comfort while requiring technical expertise that could only be obtained through sustained contact with Roman engineering traditions. The mosaic floors that decorated the villa's reception rooms revealed the extent to which British craftsmen had mastered classical artistic techniques while developing distinctive regional styles that reflected local preferences and available materials. The famous Cupid on a dolphin mosaic, executed with technical precision that matched anything produced in Italy or Gaul, demonstrated that British workshops had achieved standards of craftsmanship that could satisfy the most demanding Roman tastes. The incorporation of British-produced materials, including local limestone and regional pottery, created cost efficiencies while establishing supply networks that would support similar projects throughout the province. The overall effect was a domestic environment that proclaimed its owners Roman sophistication while remaining fundamentally adapted to British conditions and requirements. The educational transformation of British elites represented perhaps the most significant aspect of Romanisation, as tribal leaders recognised that their children's future success within the imperial system depended on mastering Latin language and literature, Roman law, and classical rhetorical techniques that governed political discourse throughout the empire. The establishment of schools in major British settlements provided formal instruction that supplemented the private tutoring arrangements that wealthy families had begun employing during the conquest period. These educational institutions, staffed by teachers drawn from throughout the Roman world, introduced British students to the intellectual traditions that defined classical civilization, while providing them with the cultural knowledge necessary for careers in imperial administration or military service. The curriculum that emerged in British schools reflected both Roman educational standards and local adaptations that addressed the specific needs of provincial students who would spend their careers mediating between imperial requirements and British local conditions. The study of Latin literature, while emphasising the classical authors that formed the foundation of Roman education, included practical training in administrative Latin that prepared students for careers in provincial government. The rhetorical training that formed the capstone of Roman education was adapted to address the specific challenges of governing populations whose cultural traditions differed significantly from Mediterranean norms. The result was an educational system that produced British leaders who could function effectively within Roman institutional structures while maintaining the cultural knowledge necessary to govern British populations who remained attached to traditional ways of life. The development of Romano-British identity among the provincial elite created social dynamics that influenced political relationships throughout the province while establishing cultural patterns that would persist long after the end of Roman rule. British aristocrats who had successfully adapted to Roman expectations found themselves occupying positions that required constant negotiation between imperial demands and local traditions, creating leadership styles that combined Roman administrative efficiency with British understanding of tribal social structures. Their children, educated in Roman schools and trained in classical cultural traditions, represented a generation that was genuinely bicultural, equally comfortable with Latin literature and Celtic oral traditions, Roman legal procedures and British customary law. The emergence of Londinium as the province's dominant commercial centre reflected both geographical advantages and deliberate imperial policy that recognised the need for economic infrastructure to support the administrative and military apparatus that Roman rule required. The settlement's location at the lowest practical crossing point of the Thames provided access to both river transport and overland routes that connected the southeastern coastal ports with the interior regions, where military operations and resource extraction were concentrated. The construction of the first London Bridge, a timber structure supported by massive oak pilings driven into the riverbed, created a permanent crossing that eliminated the seasonal variations in river transport, while providing a focal point for road networks that would eventually connect every major settlement in the province. The rapid growth of Londinium's commercial district during the decades following the conquest demonstrated the economic dynamism that Roman commercial practices could generate when applied to British resources and markets. The wharves constructed along the Thames's northern bank provided berthing for vessels that brought Mediterranean luxury goods, Gallic manufactured products, and Germanic raw materials while loading British exports that included grain, metals, hunting dogs, and slaves. The warehouses that lined the waterfront, built with timber frames and tile roofs that followed Roman commercial architectural standards, provided secure storage for goods awaiting transport while creating the infrastructure necessary for the credit and banking arrangements that facilitated long-distance trade. The forum complex that dominated central Londinium represented the most ambitious public building project undertaken in Britain during the 1st century AD, creating civic facilities that could accommodate the administrative and commercial activities that provincial capital status required. The basilica, measuring 500 feet in length and 100 feet in width, provided space for legal proceedings, commercial negotiations, and public assemblies while demonstrating Roman architectural capabilities to British audiences who had never previously encountered buildings of such scale and sophistication. The colonnaded galleries that surrounded the central nave created protected spaces for commercial activities while providing acoustic properties that enhanced the effectiveness of public speaking and legal argument. The shops and offices that occupied the ground floor of the Basilica complex created economic opportunities for both Roman immigrants and British entrepreneurs who had adapted their traditional crafts to serve urban markets. The metalworking shops that produced both utilitarian items and luxury goods demonstrated the technical capabilities that British craftsmen had developed while incorporating Roman design elements that appealed to provincial consumers. The pottery workshops that supplied the growing urban population with both everyday vessels and decorative items created employment for British workers while introducing Mediterranean ceramic traditions that influenced local artistic development. The bakeries, taverns, and food shops that served the daily needs of Londinium's population created service economies that supported thousands of workers while generating tax revenues that contributed to provincial administration costs. The residential districts that developed around Londinium's commercial core reflected the social stratification that Roman urban planning typically created, while accommodating the specific requirements of British provincial society. The wealthy districts, featuring stone-built houses with private courtyards and elaborate decorative schemes, provided domestic environments that matched anything available in Gaul or Spain, while incorporating heating systems and architectural modifications that addressed British climatic conditions. The middle-class residential areas, characterised by timber-framed construction and shared courtyard facilities, offered living standards that represented significant improvements over traditional British housing, while remaining affordable for skilled craftsmen and minor officials whose incomes depended on the urban economy. The development of Eboracum as the military and administrative centre for northern Britain created urban facilities that combined fortress requirements with civilian commercial needs, while establishing architectural precedents that influenced settlement development throughout the frontier regions. The legionary fortress, constructed to house the 6th Legion and its auxiliary support units, featured stone defences and internal buildings that demonstrated Roman military engineering capabilities, while providing secure facilities for the administrative apparatus that governed the northern territories. The canobae that developed outside the fortress walls created civilian communities that served military needs while providing economic opportunities for British populations who had adapted their traditional skills to serve Roman markets. The amphitheatre constructed at Eboracum represented the northernmost example of this distinctively Roman building type in the empire, demonstrating imperial commitment to providing classical entertainment facilities even in frontier regions, where security concerns might have justified more utilitarian approaches to urban development. The timber and earth construction, while less permanent than the stone amphitheatres of Mediterranean cities, provided seating for approximately 8,000 spectators, while featuring arena facilities that could accommodate both gladiatorial contests and wild animal hunts. The construction techniques, adapted to local materials and climatic conditions, created structural solutions that influenced civilian building projects throughout northern Britain while demonstrating Roman engineering adaptability. The religious complex at Aquae Sulis revealed the sophisticated theological negotiations that occurred when Roman religious practices encountered established British sacred sites, creating syncretic traditions that satisfied both imperial religious requirements and local spiritual needs. The natural hot springs that had attracted British religious activity for centuries provided the foundation for Roman bathhouse construction that transformed a Celtic sacred site into a classical healing centre, while maintaining the spiritual associations that made the location significant to British populations. The temple dedicated to Sulis Minerva represented theological innovation that combined Roman divine attributes with British goddess traditions, creating religious synthesis that appealed to both Roman immigrants and Romanised Britons. The engineering achievements represented by the Aquae Sulis bath complex demonstrated Roman hydraulic capabilities at their most sophisticated, while addressing the specific challenges of managing natural hot springs whose mineral content and temperature required specialized construction techniques. The lead pipes that distributed heated water throughout the complex, manufactured by British workshops using techniques learned from Roman engineers, created distribution systems that maintained water temperature while providing the pressure necessary for fountain displays and therapeutic baths. The drainage systems that managed wastewater and overflow, constructed with stone channels and terracotta pipes that followed Mediterranean engineering principles, prevented flooding while maintaining the sanitary conditions that Roman bathing culture required. The Great Bath itself, measuring 80 feet by 40 feet and lined with lead sheets that prevented mineral deposits from damaging the stone construction, provided bathing facilities that could accommodate hundreds of visitors while maintaining water quality that met Roman standards for therapeutic bathing. The surrounding colonnades, featuring columns carved by British stonemasons working under Roman supervision, created architectural environments that combined classical proportions with decorative elements that reflected local artistic traditions. The changing rooms, massage areas, and social spaces that surrounded the main bath created comprehensive leisure facilities that introduced British populations to Roman concepts of public bathing, while providing economic opportunities for service providers who catered to visiting Romans and Romanized Britons. The architectural innovations that emerged from Romano-British building projects demonstrated the creative synthesis that occurred when classical design principles encountered British materials, climatic conditions, and construction traditions. The hypocaust heating systems that became standard features in Romano-British buildings represented technological adaptations that addressed the heating requirements of Northern European conditions while maintaining the architectural aesthetics that Roman domestic design required. The underfloor heating channels, constructed with tile pillars that supported stone or concrete floors, distributed heated air throughout buildings while providing the consistent temperatures that made Roman lifestyle possible in British climatic conditions. The development of Romano-British building techniques created construction capabilities that combined Roman engineering knowledge with British understanding of local materials and environmental conditions. The use of British limestone and sandstone in classical architectural applications required quarrying and stoneworking techniques that adapted Mediterranean masonry traditions to Northern European geological conditions. The timber framing methods that British carpenters developed for Roman-style buildings incorporated traditional British woodworking skills with classical proportional systems, creating structural solutions that satisfied Roman aesthetic requirements while utilising locally available materials and established craft traditions. The introduction of Roman currency systems transformed British economic relationships while creating monetary infrastructure that integrated provincial markets with imperial commercial networks. The establishment of mints at Londinium and other major settlements provided locally produced coinage that met Roman weight and purity standards, while featuring designs that reflected both imperial authority and British regional identity. The bronze sestertii and denarii that circulated throughout the province created standardized value systems that facilitated commercial transactions while providing imperial administrators with tools for taxation and financial control that traditional British barter systems could not support. The commercial networks that developed around Roman currency systems created economic relationships that extended far beyond Britain's borders, while transforming traditional British production and exchange patterns. The export of British agricultural products, including grain and livestock, generated currency earnings that could be used to purchase Mediterranean luxury goods and manufactured items that British workshops could not yet produce. The import of Roman pottery, glassware and metalwork created markets for provincial merchants, while introducing British consumers to manufactured goods, whose quality and variety exceeded anything that traditional British craft production could provide. The agricultural improvements that accompanied Romanization created productivity increases that supported larger populations, while generating surplus production that could sustain urban development and military operations. The introduction of Roman farming techniques, including systematic crop rotation, selective breeding of livestock, and improved ploughing methods, increased agricultural yields while reducing the labour requirements that had limited traditional British farming productivity. The construction of Roman-style granaries and storage facilities provided secure storage for agricultural surpluses while creating infrastructure that supported long-distance trade in grain and other agricultural products. The industrial developments that emerged during the Roman period transformed British craft production from household-based activities into systematic manufacturing that could supply both local and export markets. The pottery industry that developed around major settlements created standardized products that combined Roman functional design with British decorative traditions, while generating employment for thousands of workers. The Samian ware produced in British workshops achieved quality standards that made British ceramics competitive in Gallic and Germanic markets, while demonstrating the technical capabilities that British craftsmen had developed under Roman influence. The metalworking industries that flourished under Roman rule exploited British mineral resources, while introducing manufacturing techniques that created products for both civilian and military markets. The iron production centres that developed in the Forest of Dean and other resource-rich regions employed Roman smelting and forging techniques that increased productivity while improving product quality. The lead mining operations in the Mendip Hills and Pennine regions provided raw materials for plumbing systems, roofing and industrial applications, while generating export revenues that contributed to provincial economic development. The prosperity and relative stability that had characterised Romano-British society during the 2nd century began to unravel during the 220 SAD, as the wider crisis engulfing the Roman Empire manifested itself in Britain through a cascade of interconnected problems that would test the province's resilience for nearly a century. The breakdown of central imperial authority, triggered by the assassination of Severus Alexander in 235 AD and the subsequent period of military anarchy that historians would later term the crisis of the 3rd century, created conditions in Britain that differed markedly from the civil wars and political instabilities that had periodically disrupted provincial life during the previous 2 centuries. The sheer scale and duration of the crisis, combined with its coincidence with increasing barbarian pressure from beyond the frontiers, created challenges that existing Roman administrative and military structures proved inadequate to address. The economic disruption that accompanied political instability manifested itself in Britain through currency debasement, inflation, and the breakdown of long-distance trade networks that had sustained provincial prosperity for generations. The silver content of Roman denarii, which had maintained relatively stable standards throughout the 2nd century, declined precipitously as successive emperors attempted to finance military campaigns and maintain soldier loyalty through expanded monetary emissions, backed by increasingly worthless metal reserves. British merchants who had grown accustomed to conducting business with reliable currency found themselves navigating commercial relationships where the value of money fluctuated unpredictably, while traditional credit arrangements became impossible to maintain across the political uncertainties that characterised imperial succession disputes. The breakdown of Mediterranean trade routes, disrupted by piracy, warfare, and the collapse of commercial credit systems, forced British producers to seek alternative markets while adapting their production to serve primarily local and regional demand. The Samian pottery workshops that had achieved export success during the 2nd century found their Mediterranean markets closed, while Germanic and Gallic customers became unreachable due to frontier warfare and political instability. British metalworking industries, deprived of imported raw materials and specialised components that continental suppliers had previously provided, were compelled to develop local substitutes while modifying their products to utilise exclusively British resources. The result was a gradual economic reorientation that emphasised regional self-sufficiency over imperial integration, creating production patterns that would persist long after political stability returned to the empire. The military pressures that accompanied economic disruption created security challenges that stretched British defensive capabilities beyond their established limits, while revealing vulnerabilities that previous periods of stability had concealed. The withdrawal of military units for continental campaigns, a recurring feature of imperial crisis management that had previously created only temporary security gaps, became a persistent drain on British garrison strength as successive emperors stripped the province of experienced troops to support their bids for imperial power. Legio VI Victrix, the primary military formation responsible for northern frontier security, found its strength reduced by detachments sent to support Severus's eastern campaigns, Caracalla's Germanic operations, and the various civil war armies that competed for imperial control throughout the middle decades of the 3rd century. The Pictish confederations that had emerged in Scotland during the later 2nd century recognised these military weaknesses as opportunities for systematic raiding that could achieve territorial and economic gains impossible during periods of strong Roman frontier control. The tribal groups that coalesced around the Pictish identity represented political innovations that transcended traditional Scottish clan structures, while creating military capabilities that exceeded anything previous Scottish resistance movements had achieved. Their adoption of Roman military techniques, learned through contact with auxiliary units recruited from Scottish territories and refined through observation of Roman frontier operations, created tactical capabilities that could challenge Roman defensive arrangements while maintaining the mobility advantages that mountainous Scottish terrain provided. The first major Pictish incursions across Hadrian's Wall, occurring during the 230 SAD, demonstrated coordination and strategic planning that exceeded Roman expectations, while revealing the extent to which reduced garrison strength had compromised frontier security. These attacks targeted not only military installations, but also the civilian settlements and agricultural communities that had developed in the wall's shadow, creating economic disruption that extended far beyond immediate military damage. The systematic destruction of villas, workshops, and commercial facilities demonstrated Pictish understanding that sustainable weakening of Roman power required attacks on the economic foundations that supported military operations, rather than purely military objectives that Roman engineering could rapidly repair. The Roman response to these escalating security threats required tactical innovations that addressed both immediate military necessities and the broader strategic challenges created by reduced imperial support for British operations. The deployment of limitanei, frontier troops recruited locally and settled on lands near the threatened boundaries, represented a fundamental shift from the professional legionary system that had previously provided British security toward a militia-based defence that relied on soldiers whose primary loyalties were to their local communities rather than distant imperial authorities. These farmer soldiers, equipped and trained according to simplified military standards that emphasised local production over imperial supply systems, created defensive capabilities that could be maintained despite the breakdown of traditional logistical support, while establishing military traditions that would influence British warfare for generations. The fortification improvements undertaken during this period reflected both immediate tactical necessities and longer-term strategic adaptations that acknowledged the changed conditions under which British defence would operate. The construction of additional towers and strongpoints along Hadrian's Wall created observation and communication capabilities that could provide early warning of Pictish movements while offering secure positions for the smaller garrisons that reduced imperial support had made necessary. The strengthening of gates and vulnerable sections with additional masonry and defensive obstacles demonstrated Roman engineering adaptability while utilising local labour and materials that reduced dependence on imperial resources. The establishment of supply depots and weapons caches at strategic locations throughout the frontier zone created logistical capabilities that could sustain defensive operations even when traditional supply lines were disrupted by political instability or enemy action. The Saxon raids that began appearing along Britain's eastern and southern coast during the mid-3rd century represented a new category of security threat that existing Roman defensive arrangements had not anticipated. These maritime attacks, launched from bases in present-day Denmark and northern Germany, exploited the mobility advantages that seaborne assault provided while targeting the wealthy coastal settlements and villas that had developed during the peaceful conditions of the 2nd century. The Saxon longships, capable of navigating both open seas and shallow coastal waters, could appear without warning at locations far from Roman military concentrations while carrying sufficient warriors to overwhelm local defences before organised resistance could be mounted. The tactical challenges that Saxon raiding presented required Roman commanders to develop new approaches to coastal defence that addressed the specific characteristics of maritime assault while maintaining the systematic defensive principles that had proven effective against land-based threats. The construction of signal towers along vulnerable coastlines created early warning systems that could alert inland garrisons to impending attacks while providing coordination for defensive responses that could intercept raiders before they could withdraw to their ships. The establishment of naval patrols, utilising vessels based at Dover, London, and other strategic ports, created mobile defensive capabilities that could engage Saxon raiders at sea while providing intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. The economic impact of Saxon raiding extended far beyond the immediate damage inflicted during individual attacks, creating psychological and commercial disruption that affected British society throughout the affected regions. The abandonment of isolated villas and coastal settlements, whose owners relocated inland to avoid repeated attacks, created demographic shifts that concentrated population in fortified towns while leaving productive agricultural land underutilised or completely abandoned. The disruption of coastal trade, as merchants avoided routes that exposed them to Saxon attack, forced commercial reorientation toward overland transport that was more expensive and less efficient than the maritime commerce that had previously sustained British economic development. The emergence of Carausius as a significant military commander during the 280 SAD reflected both the opportunities that crisis conditions created for ambitious individuals and the extent to which British defensive requirements had evolved beyond the capabilities of traditional imperial military organisation. His appointment as commander of the Classis Britannica, the Roman fleet responsible for channel security and anti-piracy operations, provided him with military resources and strategic position that made him the most powerful Roman official in Britain while offering opportunities for the independent action that imperial weakness had made necessary for effective provincial defence. His success in suppressing Saxon raiding, achieved through tactical innovations that combined naval operations with coordinated land-based responses, demonstrated military capabilities that exceeded those of most contemporary imperial commanders, while establishing his reputation among British populations as their most effective protector. The accusations of collusion with Saxon raiders that led to Carausius's condemnation by imperial authorities reflected both the paranoid suspicions that characterised imperial politics during the crisis period and the practical realities of frontier defence that often required accommodation with enemy forces to achieve broader strategic objectives. His alleged practice of allowing Saxon raids to proceed before intercepting them on their return voyages, while providing opportunities for recovering stolen goods and capturing raiders, created appearances of collaboration that imperial prosecutors could exploit while ignoring the tactical advantages that such methods provided for British security. The decision to order his execution, made by co-emperors Diocletian and Maximian in 286 AD, eliminated a commander whose military effectiveness had proven invaluable while creating the political crisis that would lead to his rebellion and the establishment of independent British rule. Carausius's declaration of independence, proclaimed following his receipt of the imperial execution order, represented both a personal survival strategy and a broader assertion of British interests that had been neglected by imperial authorities preoccupied with continental crises. His assumption of imperial titles and the establishment of a separate British government demonstrated political ambitions that extended beyond simple military rebellion toward the creation of a legitimate alternative to the failing central imperial system. The support he received from British military units, civilian populations and Gallic territories that had similarly suffered from imperial neglect, suggested that his rebellion addressed widespread dissatisfaction with imperial governance while offering practical alternatives that could provide more effective protection than distant imperial authorities had proven capable of delivering. The British Empire that Carausius established represented a unique experiment in regional independence that demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of provincial autonomy during the imperial crisis period. His government, based in Londinium but controlling territories that included not only Britain but also portions of northern Gaul, created administrative structures that combined Roman institutional forms with practical adaptations that addressed the specific requirements of governing territories that had been effectively abandoned by central imperial authority. The minting of high-quality silver coins bearing his image and imperial titles provided monetary stability that had been absent from official imperial currency, while demonstrating his government's capacity to maintain the economic infrastructure that provincial prosperity required. The military innovations that Carausius implemented during his decade-long reign created defensive capabilities that exceeded anything previous British administrations had achieved, while establishing tactical precedents that would influence British warfare for generations. His integration of Saxon mercenaries into British defensive forces, while controversial among Roman traditionalists, provided military capabilities that could counter Saxon raiding techniques while offering employment opportunities that transformed potential enemies into allies. The fortification improvements that his government undertook, including the construction of new coastal forts and the strengthening of existing defensive positions, created infrastructure that would serve British defence needs long after his death, while demonstrating the construction capabilities that regional resources could support when properly organised. The assassination of Carausius by his finance minister Electus in 293 AD eliminated the most capable leader that independent Britain had produced, while creating succession problems that would ultimately lead to the collapse of British independence. Electus, whose background in financial administration had provided him with detailed knowledge of government operations but limited military experience, proved incapable of maintaining the military effectiveness that had sustained Carausius's regime, while facing the systematic reconquest campaign that Constantius Chlorus had begun organising. His attempts to maintain popular support through reduced taxation and increased military spending created fiscal problems that undermined defensive capabilities while failing to address the fundamental military challenges that Roman reconquest efforts presented. The Roman reconquest campaign that Constantius Chlorus launched in 296 AD demonstrated both the military capabilities that the Tetrarchy system had restored to imperial operations and the tactical innovations that had emerged from decades of crisis warfare. The two-pronged assault that he organised, featuring simultaneous landings on Britain's southern and eastern coasts, prevented British forces from concentrating their defensive efforts while exploiting the superior logistical capabilities that continental resources provided. The diversionary attacks that preceded the main assault created tactical confusion that allowed Roman forces to establish secure beachheads before British resistance could be effectively organised, while the coordination between different invasion forces demonstrated the strategic planning capabilities that had been largely absent from imperial operations during the height of the 3rd century crisis. The battle near London that ended Electus's reign and restored Roman rule to Britain revealed both the military weaknesses that had developed during the period of independence and the tactical advantages that Roman military organisation continued to provide over less systematically organised opponents. The British forces, despite their familiarity with local terrain and their motivation to defend their independence, proved unable to counter the disciplined assault techniques that Roman training and equipment provided, while lacking the tactical coordination that professional military leadership could have supplied. The death of Electus during the fighting eliminated the last significant resistance to Roman reconquest, while providing Constantius with the symbolic victory that his political position required. The administrative reforms that Diocletian implemented following the reconquest of Britain represented both punishment for the province's rebellion and practical recognition that the conditions that had enabled independence required systematic address to prevent future separatist movements. The division of Britain into 4 separate provinces, Britannia Prima, Britannia Secunda, Flavia Caesariensis, and Maxima Caesariensis, created administrative units that were too small to support independent rebellion, while providing more responsive governance that could address local conditions more effectively than the previous unified provincial system had managed. The appointment of separate governors for each province, responsible directly to imperial authorities rather than to regional commanders who might develop independent ambitions, created administrative oversight that reduced opportunities for the kind of military autonomy that had enabled Carausius's rebellion. The military reorganisation that accompanied administrative reform reflected both immediate security requirements and longer-term strategic planning that addressed the changed conditions under which British defence would operate during the 4th century. The construction of the Saxon shore fort system, extending from the Wash to the Solent, created coordinated coastal defences that could respond systematically to maritime threats, while providing secure bases for the naval operations that channel security required. These fortifications, built according to standardised designs that incorporated lessons learned from decades of Saxon raiding, featured thick walls, projecting bastions, and internal arrangements that could accommodate both military garrisons and civilian populations during periods of intensive attack. The architectural innovations represented by the Saxon shore forts demonstrated Roman military engineering at its most sophisticated, while addressing the specific tactical challenges that maritime defence presented. The walls, constructed with alternating courses of stone and tile that provided both structural strength and visual distinction, reached heights of 30 feet while maintaining thicknesses that could resist both direct assault and siege artillery. The projecting towers that punctuated these defensive perimeters provided platforms for artillery deployment while creating interlocking fields of fire that could engage attacking forces from multiple angles. The water gates that provided access to harbours and rivers within the defensive perimeters allowed secure berthing for Roman vessels while preventing enemy ships from utilising these facilities during successful attacks. The garrison arrangements for the Saxon shore forts reflected the military realities that 3rd century warfare had created, while acknowledging the reduced resources that imperial recovery had made available for British defence. The Limitanei units that manned these installations combined military training with civilian occupations that made them largely self-supporting, while maintaining the defensive capabilities that coastal security required. These soldier farmers, settled on lands adjacent to their military duties, created communities that had vested interests in local defence, while reducing the costs that traditional professional military units imposed on imperial resources. The integration of British recruits with continental personnel created military units that possessed both local knowledge and imperial training, while establishing social relationships that would influence British military culture for generations. The religious transformation that would ultimately reshape the fundamental character of Romano-British civilization began not with imperial proclamation or systematic missionary activity, but through the quiet testimony of individual converts whose faith challenged the established religious order that had sustained Roman rule for nearly 2 centuries. The earliest Christian presence in Britain remains shrouded in the fragmentary evidence that characterises most aspects of religious life during the 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Yet, the archaeological record and later hagiographical accounts suggest that the new faith had established roots in British soil well before Constantine's momentous decision to embrace Christianity as imperial policy. The martyrdom of St. Alban, traditionally dated to the persecution under Diocletian around 305 AD, provides the most substantial evidence for organised Christian activity in pre-Constantinian Britain, while revealing the social conditions that both facilitated and constrained Christian expansion during the late imperial period. Alban, described in later sources as a Romano-British citizen of Verulamium, encountered Christianity through his decision to shelter a fleeing priest during one of the periodic persecutions that imperial authorities had implemented to maintain religious conformity throughout the provinces. The transformation that this encounter produced, leading Alban to exchange clothes with the priest to facilitate his escape before declaring his own conversion when arrested in the priest's place, demonstrated the personal courage that early Christian commitment required, while illustrating the networks of protection and mutual support that sustained Christian communities during hostile periods. The details of Alban's trial and execution, preserved in Bede's 8th century account but drawing on earlier sources that may reflect authentic traditions, reveal both the legal procedures that Roman authorities employed against Christians and the social tensions that religious nonconformity created within provincial society. The judge's attempts to persuade Alban to sacrifice to Roman gods, combined with his evident reluctance to execute a citizen whose previous conduct had been exemplary, demonstrated the administrative challenges that Christian persecution presented to Roman officials who were required to enforce religious policies that often conflicted with their practical governance responsibilities. Alban's refusal to compromise, maintained despite offers of leniency that might have preserved his life while allowing faith-saving accommodation with imperial religious requirements, established precedents for Christian resistance that would influence British religious culture for generations. The location of Alban's execution on a hill outside Verulamium, later commemorated by the construction of a shrine that would eventually become one of Britain's most important pilgrimage centres, created sacred geography that transformed the physical landscape while establishing religious focal points that could sustain Christian identity across generations of political change. The spring that allegedly appeared during Alban's final moments, providing water for his last earthly needs while demonstrating divine approval of his sacrifice, became a site of miraculous healing that attracted pilgrims from throughout Britain, while creating economic activities that supported local Christian communities. The burial site itself, marked initially by simple monuments that Christian believers could recognise without attracting hostile official attention, gradually evolved into elaborate architectural complexes that proclaimed Christian triumph over imperial persecution. The broader Christian community that Alban's martyrdom revealed had evidently achieved sufficient organisation and visibility to attract systematic persecution, while maintaining the internal structure necessary to preserve and transmit the accounts of his death that would later inspire British Christian identity. The presence of a priest whose safety Alban had protected suggested established clerical hierarchies that could provide pastoral care and sacramental services while maintaining the theological knowledge necessary to instruct converts and refute pagan religious practices. The Christian population that witnessed Alban's execution, described in later accounts as including both open believers and secret sympathisers whose conversion his courage inspired, indicated social networks that extended beyond immediate family relationships, while encompassing individuals from various social classes and occupational backgrounds. The geographical distribution of early Christian evidence throughout Britain suggests patterns of expansion that reflected both Roman administrative networks and indigenous British social structures, creating religious communities that combined imperial organisational methods with local cultural adaptations. Archaeological discoveries at sites including Lullingston, Hinton, St Mary and Water Newton have revealed Christian symbols, religious art and liturgical objects that demonstrate the material culture of British Christianity during the 3rd and early 4th centuries, while providing evidence for the social contexts within which Christian communities developed. The villa at Lullingston, featuring wall paintings that combined Christian imagery with classical mythological themes, illustrated the complex cultural negotiations that Christian conversion required among wealthy Romano-British families whose social status depended on maintaining relationships with both Christian and pagan neighbours. The chi-rho symbols that appeared on mosaics, wall paintings, and portable objects throughout late Roman Britain represented more than simple religious identification. They demonstrated the confidence that Christian communities had developed in proclaiming their faith through visual culture that could be recognised by fellow believers, while remaining sufficiently ambiguous to avoid attracting persecution from hostile authorities. The Water-Newton treasure, comprising silver vessels and votive plaques that clearly served Christian liturgical purposes, revealed the material prosperity that some British Christian communities had achieved while providing evidence for organised religious activities that required specialised equipment and formal ceremonial procedures. The Latin inscriptions on these objects, requesting divine favour and commemorating religious dedications, demonstrated the literacy and classical education that British Christian leaders possessed, while indicating their integration into broader imperial Christian culture. The Edict of Milan, proclaimed by Constantine and Licinius in 313 AD, transformed the legal and social position of British Christians from persecuted minority to protected religious community, while creating opportunities for public religious expression that had been impossible during the previous century of intermittent persecution. The immediate impact of this policy change manifested itself through the construction of public Christian buildings, the open celebration of Christian festivals, and the participation of British bishops in imperial religious activities that demonstrated Christianity's new status as a legitimate and favoured religious tradition. The church construction that began during the 310s and 320s represented not merely architectural achievement, but also social transformation that relocated Christian worship from private houses and secret meeting places to public buildings that could accommodate large congregations while proclaiming Christian triumph over pagan religious traditions. The Council of Arles, convened in 314 AD to address the Donatist controversy that was disrupting Christian unity in North Africa, provided the first documented evidence for British participation in imperial Christian ecclesiastical organisation, while revealing the extent to which British Christianity had achieved institutional development sufficient to warrant representation in empire-wide religious deliberations. The three British bishops who attended this council, Eborius of York, Restitutus of London, and Adelphius of Lincoln, represented episcopal sees that corresponded to major Roman administrative centres, while demonstrating the integration of Christian ecclesiastical organisation with existing imperial governmental structures. Their participation in theological debates concerning clerical authority, sacramental validity and church discipline indicated both their theological sophistication and their acceptance as equals by their continental colleagues. The geographical distribution of these early British episcopal sees reflected strategic thinking that prioritised Christian organisation in locations where imperial administrative and military presence could provide protection, while offering access to the communication networks that ecclesiastical coordination required. York's position as the military headquarters for northern Britain made its bishop responsible for Christian communities throughout the frontier regions, while providing opportunities for missionary activity among military personnel whose service carried them throughout the empire. London's commercial importance and administrative functions created similar opportunities for Christian expansion, while offering connections to continental Christian communities through the trade networks that sustained British economic development. Lincoln's position as a legionary fortress and administrative centre provided comparable advantages while extending Christian organisation into the central regions of Britain that had previously lacked systematic ecclesiastical oversight. The theological positions that British bishops adopted during the early 4th century controversies revealed both their orthodox Christian commitment and their practical understanding of the political implications that religious disputes could create for provincial stability. Their support for imperial religious policies, demonstrated through their participation in councils that condemned various heretical movements, indicated their recognition that Christian success in Britain depended on maintaining favourable relationships with imperial authorities while avoiding the factional disputes that had disrupted Christian communities in other provinces. The absence of British involvement in the major theological controversies that characterised 4th century Christianity suggested either theological consensus that avoided divisive disputes or deliberate policy decisions that prioritised practical church development over abstract theological speculation. The archaeological evidence for Christian church construction during the 4th century demonstrates both the architectural ambitions of British Christian communities and their adaptation of classical building traditions to serve Christian liturgical requirements. The church at Silchester, built during the 320s or 330s, featured a basilican plan that followed continental Christian architectural precedents while incorporating construction techniques and decorative elements that reflected local Romano-British building traditions. The nave, measuring approximately 57 feet in length and 28 feet in width, provided space for congregational worship, while the apsidal chancel created a focal point for altar placement and clerical activities. The baptistry, constructed as a separate building adjacent to the main church, featured the octagonal plan and sunken font that had become standard for Christian initiation ceremonies, while demonstrating the theological sophistication that British Christian communities had achieved. The church at Richborough, constructed within the walls of the Saxon Shore Fort during the later 4th century, illustrated the integration of Christian religious activities with military installations, while providing evidence for Christian influence among the Limitaneae units that defended Britain's eastern coast. The building's modest dimensions, measuring approximately 30 feet by 20 feet, reflected both the space constraints imposed by fortress construction and the relatively small size of the Christian community that it served. The simple rectangular plan, lacking the architectural elaboration that characterized urban churches, demonstrated practical adaptations that made Christian worship possible within military contexts, while maintaining the essential liturgical arrangements that Christian ceremonial required. The transformation of pagan religious sites into Christian places of worship represented one of the most significant aspects of Britain's religious conversion, while revealing the complex negotiations between Christian theology and established British sacred traditions. The church constructed over the Romano-British temple at Maiden Castle demonstrated both Christian triumph over pagan religious practices and practical recognition that established sacred sites possess spiritual significance that could be redirected rather than simply destroyed. The retention of the temple's basic orientation, while modifying its internal arrangements to accommodate Christian liturgical requirements, created architectural synthesis that satisfied Christian theological demands, while maintaining continuity with traditional British religious geography. The conversion of the temple complex at Bath illustrated similar processes of religious transformation that combined Christian theological requirements with respect for the healing traditions that had made the site significant to both Roman and British populations. The gradual modification of the temple facilities to accommodate Christian pilgrimage, while maintaining the therapeutic bathing activities that had sustained the site's reputation, created religious synthesis that expanded Christian appeal while preserving the practical benefits that had attracted visitors for centuries. The Christian inscriptions that appeared alongside traditional votive offerings demonstrated the coexistence of different religious traditions during the transitional period, while indicating the gradual process through which Christian practices replaced pagan religious activities. The emergence of distinctively British Christian artistic traditions during the 4th century reflected both continental Christian influences and indigenous British aesthetic preferences, creating visual culture that proclaimed Christian identity while maintaining connections to established Romano-British artistic traditions. The Christian mosaics discovered at Hinton St Mary, featuring the Chi-Rho symbol combined with portraits that may represent Christ, demonstrated the technical capabilities that British Christian communities could command, while revealing their confidence in creating religious art that combined theological sophistication with aesthetic achievement. The integration of Christian symbols with traditional Roman decorative motifs created artistic synthesis that appealed to Romano-British audiences while proclaiming Christian theological messages through visual culture that educated and inspired Christian believers. The Pelagian heresy that emerged in Britain during the late 4th and early 5th centuries represented both the theological sophistication that British Christianity had achieved and the independence of thought that distance from continental ecclesiastical centres had fostered among the British Christian intellectuals. Pelagius, a British monk whose teachings would ultimately be condemned as heretical by church councils throughout the empire, developed theological positions that emphasized human moral responsibility while challenging the Augustinian doctrines of original sin and divine grace that were becoming orthodox Christian teaching. His assertion that humans possess the natural capacity to choose good over evil without requiring divine intervention reflected both classical philosophical influences and practical Christian experience that suggested moral improvement was possible through human effort rather than supernatural assistance. The theological controversy that Pelagian teaching generated revealed fundamental disagreements about human nature, divine authority, and the relationship between classical philosophical traditions and Christian revelation that would influence Western Christian thought for generations. Pelagius's emphasis on moral responsibility and human capability appealed to educated Romano-British Christians whose classical education had emphasized virtue ethics and rational moral choice, while challenging theological positions that seemed to diminish human dignity through assertions of natural moral incapacity. His rejection of infant baptism as unnecessary for salvation, based on his denial that newborn children bore guilt for Adam's sin, created practical pastoral problems while raising theological questions about the nature of sin, redemption, and divine justice that required systematic theological response. The spread of Pelagian teaching throughout Britain during the early 5th century demonstrated both the appeal of its theological positions among British Christian intellectuals and the institutional weaknesses that enabled heretical doctrines to flourish without effective ecclesiastical oversight. The absence of strong episcopal authority capable of enforcing theological orthodoxy created conditions where individual teachers could develop and propagate religious ideas without systematic examination of their compatibility with established Christian doctrine. The social networks that connected British Christian communities, while facilitating religious communication and mutual support, also provided channels through which heterodox teachings could spread rapidly while avoiding the scrutiny that more centralized ecclesiastical organization might have provided. The visits of Bishops Germanus of Auxerre and Lupus of Troyes to Britain in 429 AD and 447 AD represented systematic continental intervention designed to combat Pelagian influence while re-establishing Orthodox Christian teaching among British Christian communities that had drifted toward theological positions that church authorities considered dangerous to Christian faith and practice. Germanus, whose reputation for theological learning and pastoral effectiveness had made him one of Gaul's most respected bishops, brought both doctrinal expertise and administrative experience that British ecclesiastical leaders apparently lacked, while providing connections to continental Christian scholarship that could address the intellectual challenges that Pelagian teaching presented. Lupus, whose monastery at Lerins had become a centre for theological education and spiritual formation, contributed monastic perspectives that emphasized divine grace and human spiritual dependence, while offering practical models for Christian community life that could counter Pelagian individualism. The public debates that Germanus organised during his British visits created opportunities for direct theological confrontation between Orthodox and Pelagian positions, while demonstrating the intellectual rigour that Christian theological discourse required. These encounters, conducted according to formal rhetorical procedures that educated audiences could appreciate, addressed fundamental questions about human nature, divine sovereignty, and Christian salvation that had practical implications for Christian life and pastoral care. The victory that Orthodox positions achieved in these debates, attributed in later accounts to both superior theological arguments and divine intervention through miraculous signs, re-established doctrinal orthodoxy while demonstrating the intellectual resources that continental Christianity could provide for addressing theological challenges that local British resources proved insufficient to resolve. The practical reforms that Germanus implemented during his visits addressed both immediate doctrinal problems and underlying institutional weaknesses that had enabled Pelagian teaching to flourish among British Christian communities. His establishment of more systematic theological education for British clergy created educational infrastructure that could maintain orthodox teaching while providing intellectual resources for addressing future theological challenges. The strengthening of episcopal authority through clearer definition of hierarchical relationships and disciplinary procedures created ecclesiastical organisation that could enforce doctrinal conformity while maintaining the pastoral flexibility that British conditions required. The integration of British Christian communities into broader continental ecclesiastical networks provided ongoing theological oversight while offering access to the scholarly resources that doctrinal orthodoxy required. The long-term impact of the Pelagian controversy on British Christianity extended beyond immediate theological questions toward fundamental issues of ecclesiastical authority, intellectual independence, and the relationship between British Christian identity and broader imperial Christian culture. The condemnation of Pelagian teaching, while re-establishing doctrinal orthodoxy, also demonstrated the extent to which British Christianity remained subject to continental ecclesiastical authority, despite the geographical isolation that had fostered theological independence. The intellectual vitality that had produced Pelagian innovation, while channeled toward orthodox conclusions, continued to characterise British Christian culture, while creating theological traditions that would influence British religious development long after the end of Roman rule. The collapse of effective Roman administration in Britain during the early 5th century represented not a single dramatic event, but rather a gradual dissolution of imperial authority that unfolded across several decades as the Western Empire struggled with cascading crises that ultimately proved insurmountable. The withdrawal of Roman military forces, the breakdown of administrative structures, and the emergence of independent British kingdoms occurred through a complex process that defied the neat chronological boundaries that later historians would attempt to impose on this transformative period. The traditional date of 410 AD, marked by Honorius's letter instructing British cities to organise their own defence, served more as a symbolic acknowledgement of existing realities than as the moment when Roman rule actually ended in Britain. The military pressures that precipitated the final breakdown of Roman authority in Britain began accumulating during the 390 SAD, as successive usurpers stripped the province of regular troops to support their bids for imperial power on the continent. Magnus Maximus's rebellion in 383 AD had already demonstrated the vulnerability of British defences when significant military forces were withdrawn for continental campaigns, but his defeat and death in 388 AD had allowed some restoration of garrison strength through the redeployment of units from other frontier regions. The more systematic military drain that began with Constantine III's usurpation in 407 AD proved far more devastating, as this British proclaimed emperor transported virtually the entire remaining regular army across the Channel to support his ultimately unsuccessful attempt to establish control over Gaul and Spain. Constantine III's decision to denude Britain of professional military forces reflected both the strategic calculations of a usurper who needed immediate military strength to establish his legitimacy and the broader imperial crisis that made such desperate measures seem necessary for political survival. His army, comprising the remnants of the legionary and auxiliary units that had defended Britain for over 3 centuries, represented the accumulated military expertise and institutional memory that had sustained Roman rule through previous periods of crisis and instability. The departure of these forces in 407 AD eliminated not only the immediate military capabilities necessary for frontier defence, but also the professional military leadership that could have organised effective resistance to the barbarian invasions that would soon overwhelm British defences. The Pictish and Scottish raids that intensified during the first decade of the 5th century encountered British defensive arrangements that had been fatally weakened by the withdrawal of regular troops while lacking the institutional structures necessary to coordinate effective resistance across tribal and regional boundaries. The Limitiné units that remained in frontier positions, while possessing local knowledge and personal investment in defending their communities, lacked the training, equipment and organisational capabilities that systematic defence against coordinated barbarian attacks required. The civilian populations of northern Britain, accustomed to relying on Roman military protection for their security, found themselves facing enemies whose tactical capabilities had evolved through generations of warfare against imperial forces, while their own defensive resources remained limited to improvised local militias. The Saxon invasions that devastated eastern and southern Britain during the 410s and 420s encountered similar conditions of military weakness and organisational collapse, but the maritime nature of these attacks created additional challenges that existing defensive arrangements proved completely incapable of addressing. The Saxon shore fort system, designed to coordinate naval and land-based responses to seaborne raiders, required professional military garrisons and centralised command structures that could no longer be maintained following the withdrawal of regular forces and the collapse of imperial administrative authority. The individual forts, while retaining their defensive capabilities against direct assault, became isolated strongholds whose limited garrisons could provide only local protection while lacking the mobility and coordination necessary to prevent Saxon forces from establishing permanent footholds in British territory. The administrative breakdown that accompanied military collapse manifested itself through the gradual cessation of imperial governmental functions that had sustained Romano-British civilization for nearly 4 centuries. The collection of taxes, which had provided the revenue necessary for maintaining military forces, public works, and administrative services, became impossible to sustain without the coercive authority that imperial power had previously provided. Local magistrates, deprived of higher authority to which they could appeal for support in enforcing unpopular policies, found their positions increasingly untenable as communities prioritised immediate survival needs over abstract obligations to distant imperial authorities who could no longer provide protection or services in return for taxation. The monetary system that had facilitated commercial exchange throughout Roman Britain experienced similar collapses. Imperial mints ceased production, and existing currency supplies became inadequate to support normal commercial activities. The debasement of silver coinage that had characterised the 3rd century crisis had already undermined confidence in imperial currency, but the complete cessation of new coin production during the early 5th century created monetary shortages that forced British communities to revert to barter systems and local exchange arrangements that had not been necessary for generations. The commercial networks that had connected British producers to continental markets, already disrupted by political instability and military conflict, became impossible to maintain without reliable currency and the legal frameworks that imperial authority had previously provided. The urban centres that had served as the focal points of Romano-British civilization experienced varying degrees of decline and transformation as the economic and administrative functions that had sustained their development disappeared or relocated to more defensible positions. Londinium, despite its commercial advantages and accumulated infrastructure, could not maintain its population or economic activities without the imperial administrative functions and military spending that had driven its growth during the previous centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that large sections of the city were abandoned during the early 5th century, with remaining populations concentrating in smaller, more defensible areas, while much of the urban infrastructure fell into disrepair through lack of maintenance and systematic demolition for building materials. The fate of other major Romano-British cities varied according to their geographical positions, defensive capabilities, and the extent to which their populations could adapt to changed circumstances. York, with its massive fortress walls and strategic position controlling river transport, maintained some urban functions while serving as a stronghold for British resistance movements that emerged in northern England. Gloucester, Winchester, and other former provincial capitals experienced similar transformations, with their populations contracting within defensible perimeters, while abandoning the extensive suburban developments that had characterized their imperial prosperity. The public buildings that had symbolized Roman civilization, basilicas, bathhouses, amphitheaters and temples, either fell into ruin through neglect or were systematically dismantled to provide building materials for defensive works and private construction projects. The villa system that had represented the pinnacle of Romano-British rural prosperity experienced equally dramatic transformation as the economic and social conditions that had sustained aristocratic rural life disappeared along with imperial authority. The wealthy British landowners who had constructed elaborate country houses during the 3rd and 4th centuries found themselves unable to maintain the specialised craftsmen, imported luxury goods, and extensive household staffs that villa life required without the commercial networks and monetary systems that imperial administration had provided. Some villas were abandoned entirely, their owners either fleeing to more secure urban locations or adapting to simpler lifestyles that required less elaborate domestic arrangements. Others were modified to serve defensive functions, with their courtyards converted into fortified enclosures and their residential quarters adapted to accommodate larger populations seeking protection from raiders and invaders. The emergence of post-Roman British kingdoms represented both the collapse of imperial political structures and the adaptation of indigenous British leadership traditions to fill the governmental vacuum that Roman withdrawal had created. The Romano-British elite who had served as magistrates, decurions and provincial officials during the imperial period possessed administrative experience and social authority that made them natural leaders during the transition to independent rule, but their education and cultural orientation had prepared them for operating within imperial institutional frameworks rather than creating entirely new governmental systems. The kingdoms that emerged during the 5th century, including those of Vortigern in central Britain, Ambrosius Aurelianus in the west, and various local strongmen throughout the former province, represented attempts to combine Roman administrative methods with British tribal leadership traditions, while addressing the immediate security and economic challenges that imperial collapse had created. The military arrangements that these post-Roman kingdoms developed reflected both the tactical lessons that centuries of Roman rule had taught, and the practical limitations that reduced resources and fragmented authority imposed on British defensive capabilities. The employment of Saxon mercenaries, initially recruited to supplement British forces against Pictish and Scottish raiders, demonstrated both the military effectiveness that Germanic warriors could provide and the dangerous precedent that reliance on barbarian military assistance established for British independence. The foederati arrangements that British leaders negotiated with Saxon warbands, granting land and payment in exchange for military service, followed imperial precedents that had been employed throughout the late Empire, while creating the conditions that would ultimately lead to Saxon political dominance over much of Britain. The cultural continuities that persisted through the collapse of Roman political authority revealed the extent to which Romano-British civilization had created hybrid identities that could survive the disappearance of imperial institutions while maintaining connections to classical traditions and Christian religious practices. The Latin literacy that had characterized educated British society continued among clerical and aristocratic populations, providing the intellectual foundations for the historical chronicles and religious literature that would preserve accounts of the transition period while maintaining connections to continental Christian culture. The Christian churches that had been established during the 4th century provided institutional continuity that transcended political boundaries while offering spiritual and practical support to communities struggling to adapt to post-imperial conditions. The archaeological evidence for continuity and change during the 5th century reveals complex patterns of adaptation that varied significantly across different regions and social classes, while demonstrating both the resilience of Romano-British culture and the profound transformations that political collapse had created. The pottery production that had supplied Romano-British markets with standardized ceramic goods experienced dramatic decline as commercial networks collapsed, and specialised workshops could no longer maintain the distribution systems that mass production required. However, local pottery traditions that combined Romano-British technical methods with simplified decorative schemes continue to serve regional markets while demonstrating the persistence of craft knowledge that imperial claps had not entirely eliminated. The building techniques that had characterised Romano-British architecture similarly experienced both decline and adaptation as communities lost access to specialised craftsmen and imported materials while retaining knowledge of construction methods that could be applied using local resources. The stoneworking capabilities that had produced elaborate public buildings and private villas continued to influence construction projects, but the scale and sophistication of post-Roman building reflected the reduced resources and changed priorities that political collapse had created. Churches, defensive works, and modest residential buildings employed Romano-British construction techniques while adapting classical architectural principles to serve the more limited requirements that post-imperial society could support. The linguistic changes that occurred during the post-Roman period reflected both the persistence of Latin as the language of education, religion, and administration among British elites, and the gradual expansion of Germanic linguistic influences as Saxon settlement increased throughout eastern and central Britain. The British Celtic languages that had survived throughout the Roman period experienced revival in regions where Roman cultural influence had been less intensive, while serving as vehicles for preserving traditional British cultural knowledge that Latin education had not entirely displaced. The complex linguistic landscape that emerged during the 5th and 6th centuries created regional variations that would influence the development of medieval British culture, while maintaining connections to both classical and indigenous intellectual traditions. The legal traditions that had governed Romano-British society experienced similar processes of adaptation and transformation as British communities developed judicial systems that combined Roman legal principles with traditional British customary law. The written legal codes that had provided the framework for imperial justice could not be maintained without the administrative apparatus that their enforcement required, but the legal concepts and procedural methods that Roman law had introduced continued to influence British approaches to dispute resolution and community governance. The emergence of law codes that combined Roman legal terminology with British customary practices created hybrid judicial systems that served post-Roman British communities while maintaining connections to classical legal traditions. The economic transformations that accompanied political collapse created both immediate hardships and long-term adaptations that would shape British development for generations. The breakdown of long-distance trade networks forced British communities to develop more localised economic systems while reducing access to the specialised goods and raw materials that imperial commerce had provided. However, this economic reorientation also created opportunities for British craftsmen and farmers to develop markets that had previously been dominated by continental imports, while fostering economic relationships that strengthened regional identities and local community bonds. The religious developments that occurred during the transition period demonstrated both the institutional strength that British Christianity had achieved during the 4th century and the theological independence that geographical isolation from continental ecclesiastical authority had fostered. The monastic movement that emerged in Western Britain during the 5th and 6th centuries created religious communities that preserved classical learning while developing distinctively British approaches to Christian spirituality and community organisation. The missionary activities that British monks would eventually undertake in Ireland, Scotland, and continental Europe demonstrated the intellectual vitality and religious commitment that British Christianity had maintained despite the political chaos that surrounded the end of Roman rule. The legacy of Roman Britain extended far beyond the immediate post-imperial period, creating cultural, institutional and material foundations that would influence British development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The urban centres that had been established during the Roman period, despite experiencing decline and transformation during the 5th century, provided geographical focal points that would eventually support the revival of town life under Anglo-Saxon and Norman rule. The road network that Roman engineers had constructed continued to serve as the primary transportation infrastructure for medieval Britain while providing the communication links that political reunification would require. The agricultural improvements that Roman farming techniques had introduced created productivity levels that could support larger populations while establishing land use patterns that would persist for centuries. The intellectual traditions that Romano-British education had fostered provided the cultural foundations for the scholarly achievements that would characterise medieval British monasticism, while maintaining connections to classical learning that would prove essential for the preservation and transmission of ancient knowledge. The legal concepts that Roman law had introduced continued to influence British judicial development, while providing intellectual resources that would contribute to the emergence of common law traditions that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. The architectural and engineering knowledge that Roman construction had demonstrated provided technical capabilities that would support the building projects that would mark the revival of British civilization under later political systems. The administrative experience that Romano-British officials had gained through centuries of imperial service created governmental knowledge that would influence the development of medieval British political institutions while providing practical understanding of the challenges that effective governance required. The military traditions that had evolved through centuries of frontier warfare provided tactical knowledge and organisational methods that would shape British military development, while creating cultural values that emphasised discipline, loyalty and systematic preparation for conflict. The end of Roman rule in Britain marked not merely the conclusion of an imperial occupation, but the transformation of a province that had been fundamentally altered by 4 centuries of Roman influence into a post-imperial society that retained essential characteristics of classical civilization while adapting to changed political and economic circumstances. The Romano-British culture that emerged from this transformation provided the foundation for the distinctive British civilization that would eventually reunite the island under Anglo-Saxon rule, while maintaining connections to European culture that would influence British development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The legacy of Roman Britain thus extended far beyond the chronological boundaries of imperial rule, creating cultural and institutional foundations that would shape British history for more than a millennium, while demonstrating the enduring influence that systematic imperial administration could exert on the societies it governed.